Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I saw the footprints, I convinced myself they were just another peculiarity of Warehouse 37, an old railway depot with countless oddities accumulated over its century of existence. But oddities don't move. They don't reposition themselves night after night, inching closer to the exit as if something invisible was slowly making its escape. And they certainly don't sink into hardened cement, as if the concrete were as soft as wet sand. My name is Thomas Reeves, and after 15 years as a customs inspector, I thought I'd seen everything. I've discovered contraband in the hollow metal legs of antique furniture, narcotics sealed inside industrial machinery, and even a live endangered species hidden in a shipment of decorative vases. But nothing in my career prepared me for what awaited me in Warehouse 37. The assignment seemed straightforward: catalog and process abandoned freight containers following a bankruptcy filing by Northeast Rail Transit. Most of the cargo had been sitting unclaimed for years, sometimes decades. The paperwork was a mess: shipping manifests missing, ownership disputed, customs declarations incomplete. The department sent me because I had a reputation for thoroughness. My supervisor joked that I could find a tax discrepancy in my sleep. If only my dreams had remained so mundane. Warehouse 37 sits on the outskirts of town, at the end of a defunct rail spur that hadn't seen a train in at least 15 years. The building itself dates back to the 1920s, a looming structure of brick and steel with windows so coated in grime that they barely let in light. The first time I turned the key in the rusted padlock, the door resisted, groaning as if warning me to reconsider my entrance. The interior was exactly what you'd expect: concrete floors, metal rafters overhead, and row upon row of shelving units filled with dust-covered cargo containers. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners, and the air tasted stale, as if it hadn't circulated in years. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, several of them dead entirely, creating alternating patches of harsh illumination and heavy shadow. I began my inventory on the far side of the warehouse, methodically working my way through shipping containers, wooden crates, and cardboard boxes. Most contained mundane items: outdated electronics, machine parts for equipment no longer manufactured, clothing that had gone out of style decades ago. The work was tedious, but straightforward. 3 days in, I reached the central corridor. That's when I first noticed them: a line of footprints that began inexplicably at the wall and terminated about 8 feet into the corridor. They were adult-sized, appearing to be from a work boot or similar heavy shoe, and each print was sunken approximately half an inch into the concrete floor. I crouched down to examine them, running my fingers along the depression. The concrete felt solid, not damaged or deteriorating. It was as if someone wearing immensely heavy boots had walked across the floor while the cement was still wet, except the warehouse floor had been poured over 80 years ago. My rational mind sought explanations. Perhaps they were decorative impressions made during construction. Maybe someone had purposely altered the floor at some point for reasons I couldn't fathom. I took photographs, made notes in my inventory log, and continued with my work, though I found my eyes continually drawn back to those mysterious impressions. Later that afternoon, I ran my metal detector over a stack of unmarked wooden crates. The device functioned normally, alerting me to nails, hinges, and other metallic components. But when I passed it over the floor near the footprints, it emitted a different tone, higher-pitched, almost musical. I moved the detector back and forth, trying to pinpoint the source. The strange tone seemed to follow the footprints, and then extend beyond them, as if marking a path invisible to my eyes. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the cold concrete. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic jingling, like keys on a ring or small metal objects knocking together. The sound came from within the floor itself. I tapped the concrete, then struck it harder with the handle of my screwdriver. The floor was solid, unquestionably so. Yet the jingling continued, unaffected by my interference. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sounds were moving, slowly, methodically tracking along the invisible extension of the footprint path. I stumbled backward, heart pounding against my ribcage. My palms grew slick with sweat and my breathing quickened. For the first time in my professional life, I felt an overwhelming urge to abandon my assignment. Instead, I packed up early, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I'd return the next day with better equipment, perhaps ground-penetrating radar or an ultrasonic device that could reveal what lay beneath the surface. I locked the warehouse door behind me and drove home, the sound of phantom keys jingling playing in my mind throughout the sleepless night that followed. The next morning I arrived as the sun was breaking over the horizon. Coffee in hand, equipment bag slung over my shoulder, I unlocked the warehouse, determined to approach the phenomenon with scientific detachment. But all thoughts of rational investigation evaporated the moment I reached the central corridor. The footprints had moved. Each impression had shifted approximately 3 inches backward from their previous position, closer to the exit door. I stood frozen, coffee spilling unnoticed over my trembling hand. My mouth went dry as cotton, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I'd locked the warehouse securely. The padlock had been intact when I arrived. No one else had a key. It was impossible for someone to have altered the floor overnight. I forced myself to approach the footprints, kneeling beside them with my camera. The impressions were identical to the day before, but unquestionably repositioned. I placed my hand inside one of the depressions, feeling its perfect contour. As my fingers traced the edge, I noticed something I'd missed previously. Tiny cracks radiating outward from each footprint, as if the concrete had fractured under enormous pressure. The metal detector confirmed what I already suspected. The jingling sounds had moved as well, now aligned with the new position of the footprints. But the noise had changed. It was louder now, more distinct. Not keys, I realized, but something like small chains or links of metal striking together with each invisible step. I spent the day cataloging inventory in other areas of the warehouse, keeping my distance from the central corridor. My work suffered as my concentration repeatedly broke, attention drawn back to those impossible footprints. Several times I thought I heard the jingling sound from across the warehouse, but when I paused to listen, only silence greeted me. That night, I researched the history of Warehouse 37. Construction had begun in 1922 and completed in 1924. The original railway company had gone bankrupt in 1931 during the Depression. Nothing remarkable stood out until I discovered a newspaper article from 1953 describing an industrial accident. A railway worker had become trapped between 2 cargo containers, the crushing pressure severing both his legs. The article mentioned he'd been wearing distinctive work boots with metal cleats and had carried the company's master key ring on his belt. He'd survived the accident but died years later in a psychiatric institution, reportedly tormented by phantom pains and insisting he could still feel his legs walking. The article included a photograph of the worker, and in the background, partially visible, was a wall of the warehouse with a painted sign, Storage Area 37. I didn't sleep that night. My mind churned with thoughts of amputated limbs that somehow continued to exist, of phantom sensations becoming material enough to leave impressions in solid concrete. I told myself it was absurd, a coincidence paired with my overactive imagination. Yet by morning, I found myself racing back to the warehouse before dawn, desperate to see if the footprints had moved again. They had, another few inches closer to the exit. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Each morning, I would arrive to find the footprints had repositioned overnight, always moving toward the exit door. I calculated that at their current rate of movement, they would reach the exit in approximately 3 weeks. The jingling sound grew progressively louder, now audible without pressing my ear to the floor. Sometimes in the periphery of my vision, I thought I caught glimpses of something dragging itself along the footprint path, a dark low shape that vanished when I turned to look directly at it. My supervisor called to check on my progress, concerned by the unusual length of time the inventory was taking. I fabricated excuses about disorganized paperwork and difficult to identify merchandise. In truth, I'd become obsessed with the footprints, spending hours documenting their movement, measuring the depth of the impressions, recording the jingling sounds. My notes filled page after page, becoming increasingly frantic and disordered. I began sleeping in my car outside the warehouse, unwilling to miss a single night's movement. On the 10th night, I decided to remain inside, hiding behind a stack of crates with a clear view of the central corridor. I brought a night vision camera, a digital recorder, and enough coffee to keep me awake until dawn. For hours, nothing happened. The warehouse creaked and settled as old buildings do. Occasionally, a distant siren or passing vehicle broke the silence. My eyelids grew heavy despite the caffeine. Just as I began to drift off, around 3:17 a.m. according to my watch, the temperature in the warehouse plummeted. My breath clouded before me, and a bone-deep chill permeated my body. The jingling started, louder than I'd ever heard it before. Through the night vision camera, I watched the empty corridor, seeing nothing but the motionless footprints in the green-tinted display. Then, inexplicably, the concrete around the last footprint began to ripple, as if momentarily liquefied. Before my disbelieving eyes, the impression shifted backward several centimeters, the concrete solidifying instantly afterward. My hands shook so violently that the camera footage became unwatchable. I pressed myself against the crates, heart hammering so loudly I feared it would give away my position. To what, I couldn't say. There was nothing visible in the corridor. Yet I felt with absolute certainty that I was not alone. A scraping sound drew my attention to the wall where the footprints originated. The brick surface appeared to bulge outward, as if something were pressing against it from the other side. The bulge took the shape of a hand, fingers splayed, palm flat against the wall. Then, impossibly, the hand impression sank into the solid brick, creating a perfect negative space. I fled. Abandoning my equipment, I ran for the exit, fumbling with the keys as the jingling sound grew louder behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was home with the doors locked and every light blazing. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. My supervisor became concerned enough to send a colleague to check on me. I refused to open the door, shouting through it that I had the flu and needed to be left alone. Eventually, facing the possibility of losing my job, I returned to work. The warehouse waited for me, looking exactly as it had before. Part of me hoped the footprints would be gone, that I had experienced some kind of mental break that had now passed. But they were still there, closer to the exit than ever, only about 10 feet away now. What choice did I have? I resumed my inventory work, cataloging boxes and crates while keeping a wary distance from the central corridor. The jingling followed me now, no longer confined to the footprint path. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly behind me, stopping when I turned around. Other times it emanated from inside the very crates I was examining, ceasing the moment I opened them. 3 nights ago, the footprints reached the exit door. I arrived that morning to find the last impression half embedded in the concrete threshold. The door itself had changed. The previously rusted metal now displayed a hand-shaped depression in its center, as if someone had pushed against it with enormous force. Today, I submitted my final report. The inventory is complete, though I admit the last section was rushed, possibly containing errors. My supervisor seemed satisfied, noting only that I looked unwell and should consider taking some vacation time. I nodded absently, my mind on the warehouse and what would happen now that the footprints had reached their destination. Tonight, as I write this, I keep glancing toward my apartment door. Twice now I've heard what sounds like jingling keys in the hallway outside, and on my way home I noticed something on the sidewalk leading to my building. A faint impression in the concrete, roughly the size and shape of a work boot, sunken slightly below the surface. I'm leaving town tomorrow. I don't know where I'm going, only that I need to put distance between myself and Warehouse 37, between myself and whatever followed those footprints out the exit door, because I know with terrible certainty that it's not confined to the warehouse anymore, and I can't shake the feeling that it knows exactly where I live. Story 2. The first note struck me like a physical blow, a hollow, discordant sound that hung in the air long after the hammer had fallen back into place. There was something wrong with this piano, something beyond mere mechanical failure or age. I've been tuning instruments for 23 years, and I've never felt a chill run down my spine from a single note. But this pianoforte, this ancient, ornate beast crouching in the corner of the dimly lit parlor, seemed to breathe the note rather than play it. And when the vibration finally died, the silence that followed was somehow worse. My name is Thomas Hargrove, and I restore pianos for a living. My specialty is historical instruments. The older and more complex, the better. That's why Robert Blackwood contacted me about the 1860 Broadwood pianoforte he'd inherited when he purchased the Elmwood estate, a crumbling Victorian mansion nestled high in the mountains where the fog never seems to lift. He'd offered triple my usual fee, plus accommodations for the week it would take to complete the restoration. A generous offer for an instrument that had likely been untouched for decades, possibly even a century. It needs to be perfect, Blackwood had insisted over the phone, his voice strangely tight. The previous owner was very particular about his instruments. It needs to be exactly as it was. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed for details about the piano's history, about why Blackwood seemed so desperate to have it working again. But the money was too good to pass up, and my curiosity about the rare model overcame my professional caution. The mansion came into view as I drove the final winding stretch of mountain road. A looming shadow against the twilight sky, all sharp angles and peeling paint, windows like vacant eyes. The evening air bit through my coat as I stepped out of my car, carrying only my tools and a small overnight bag. Blackwood met me at the door, a tall, gaunt man with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He barely spoke as he led me through the cavernous entryway, past faded portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes following our progress across threadbare carpets. "The piano is in there," he said, pointing to a pair of double doors at the end of a long hallway. "I've had a room prepared for you upstairs. I'll be away on business until tomorrow evening. Please don't disturb anything else in the house." Before I could ask any questions, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the heavy front door slammed shut. Alone in the mansion, I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. I pushed it aside. I had a job to do. The parlor was a time capsule. Heavy velvet drapes, ornate furniture draped in white sheets, and in the corner by the tall windows, the pianoforte. It was magnificent even in its decay. Rich mahogany with intricate carvings, brass pedals gleaming dully in the fading light. 7 unlit candles stood on its closed lid, arranged in a perfect semicircle. I didn't touch them. I set up my portable work lamp and began my initial assessment. The keys were yellowed with age, some cracked, others missing entirely. The strings were rusted, many broken, the felt hammers moth-eaten and brittle. It would be a challenging restoration, but nothing I hadn't handled before. When I pressed the first key, expecting the dull thud of a dead note, I was startled by a soft hiss, like an exhale. A chill breeze seemed to emanate from between the keys, making the flames of my lamp flicker. I leaned closer, examining the action mechanism, when I noticed the candles on the lid trembling slightly, though there was no draft in the closed room. I worked until well past midnight, removing the key slip to access the action. Each key I removed seemed unnaturally cold, as if carved from ice rather than ivory. When I finally decided to call it a night, my fingers were numb despite the warmth of the small space heater I'd set up. My room was on the 3rd floor, a sparse chamber with a narrow bed and a small writing desk. I fell into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of cascading scales played by invisible hands. I woke before dawn, covered in sweat despite the chill in the room. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound, I thought, though the house was now silent. I dressed quickly and returned to the parlor, drawn by an urgency I couldn't explain. The pianoforte waited in the gray morning light, looking almost predatory in the shadows. I resumed my work, carefully removing the rusted strings, replacing them one by one. Each string I tightened seemed to respond differently than any piano I'd worked on before. Instead of the gradual increase in pitch as I turned the tuning hammer, the notes would suddenly jump to perfect pitch, as if guided by an unseen hand, and each perfectly tuned string would vibrate softly on its own for several seconds afterward, sustaining without being struck. By midday, I had restored the middle register. That's when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from inside the instrument. I froze, tuning hammer in hand, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable, a steady beat, like a heart in 4/4 time, emanating from the soundboard. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, or perhaps water pipes in the walls. But when I placed my hand on the pianoforte side, I felt the vibration, a pulse, warm and organic beneath the cold, polished wood. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become, how my own heart was racing to match the rhythm coming from the instrument. The 7 candles on the lid, though unlit, began to flicker as if caught in a breeze. But the air in the room was still, heavy with dust and the faint smell of beeswax. I forced myself to continue working. As I moved to the bass strings, the heart-like thumping grew louder, more insistent. When I struck a low C to check my tuning, the note lingered, then slowly bent upward to C-sharp without my touch. I backed away, watching in disbelief as the hammers began to move on their own, ever so slightly, as if being pressed by phantom fingers. I needed air. I stumbled out of the parlor, down the long hallway to the front door, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pushed, pulled, even threw my shoulder against the heavy oak, but it remained firmly shut, as if sealed by something stronger than locks. Panic rose in my throat as I tried window after window, finding each one immovable. I was trapped inside, with nightfall approaching and Blackwood not due back until evening. I returned to the parlor reluctantly, drawn by the soft, insistent music now emanating from the pianoforte, a slow, melancholy melody I didn't recognize, played so softly it might have been coming from another room. But there was no one else in the house, and the hammers were still. I approached cautiously, my skin crawling with gooseflesh despite the sweat beating on my forehead. The melody continued, growing slightly louder as I came nearer. It wasn't the hammers striking the strings. It was the strings themselves, vibrating without being struck, playing a composition that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sorrow. I needed to understand what was happening. My rational mind grasped for explanations, resonance from somewhere else in the house, a trick of acoustics, my own exhaustion playing tricks on me. I knelt beside the instrument, pressing my ear against its side. The music stopped abruptly. In its place, the heartbeat returned, louder now, perfectly steady. And then a voice, or something like a voice, whispered from within the wooden chamber, "You've brought me back. Now you must play." I recoiled, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. The candles on the lid suddenly ignited, 7 flames burning tall and straight, casting long shadows across the parlor floor. The lid of the pianoforte slowly raised itself, revealing the newly strung interior, strings gleaming like fresh surgical sutures. My legs trembled as I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath visible in the sudden cold. The heartbeat from the piano grew louder, faster, the wood of the case expanding and contracting like a chest rising and falling. Blackwood had said the previous owner was particular about his instruments. He'd said it needed to be exactly as it was. What he hadn't mentioned was why. I spent the next hours huddled in the corner of the parlor, watching as the pianoforte occasionally played short phrases. Never a complete piece, just fragments, like a musician trying to remember a long-forgotten composition. The candles burned but never diminished, their flames dancing in perfect synchronization with the music. As twilight deepened outside the tall windows, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Blackwood had returned. I rushed to the parlor door, pounding on it, shouting for help. The footsteps paused outside the door. "Mr. Blackwood, the piano. There's something wrong with it. Please let me out." His voice came through the door, calm and detached. He said he couldn't do that, not until the restoration was complete. The maestro needed his instrument, he explained. The maestro had been waiting so long, trapped in silence. Blackwood's grandfather had promised to maintain the instrument, but after his death, no one had kept that promise. Until now. I demanded to know what he meant, my voice breaking with fear. His answer chilled me more than the cold emanating from the pianoforte. The maestro had been a brilliant composer, he said, but his true genius lay in finding ways to preserve his consciousness beyond death. He'd constructed the pianoforte himself, incorporating materials that Blackwood would not specify. When he felt death approaching, he'd performed a ritual, binding himself to the instrument. But over the decades, the piano had deteriorated, weakening the connection. The maestro needed it restored to continue his great work. "He just needs a conductor now," Blackwood said, his voice fading as he moved away from the door. "Someone with the right hands. He chose you, Mr. Hargrove. Your reputation precedes you." Left alone again with the increasingly active instrument, I watched in horror as the keys began to depress on their own, playing a complex progression of chords. The heartbeat sound had synchronized perfectly with my own racing pulse. The air from between the keys had become a cold wind, carrying the scent of decay and something metallic, like old blood. I had to finish the restoration. It was the only way out. With trembling hands, I returned to my work, installing the remaining strings, adjusting the action. Each completed section caused the invisible presence in the room to grow stronger. The temperature continued to drop until ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows. My fingers moved mechanically, driven by terror and the desperate hope that completing the job would mean my release. As I tuned the final string, a high A at the upper end of the keyboard, the entire instrument shuddered violently. The candles flared, their flames reaching nearly to the ceiling. The pianoforte's case expanded and contracted rapidly, like a creature gasping for air. Then silence fell, complete and absolute. In that silence, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a physical manifestation of the entity that had been trapped in the instrument. But there was nothing visible, only a displacement of the air, a density to the shadows that suggested a human form. The keys began to move again, playing a complex, beautiful piece I'd never heard before. The invisible presence moved to stand beside me, and I felt a cold pressure on my shoulder, like a hand resting there. The voice from within the pianoforte spoke again, clearer now. "Sit. Play with me." I found myself moving to the bench, sitting before the keyboard. My hands hovered over the keys, shaking uncontrollably. The cold pressure guided my right hand to the keys, pressing my fingers down to play a simple melody. The left hand followed, adding harmony. I wasn't playing. It was playing through me, using my hands as its own. I could feel it entering me through my fingertips, a cold, ancient consciousness seeping into my mind like water into parched soil. Memories that weren't mine flashed behind my eyes, concerts in grand European halls, compositions scratched onto parchment by candlelight, a dark ritual performed as death approached. With what remained of my own will, I fought against it, trying to pull my hands away from the keys. The pressure on my shoulders increased, becoming painful. The voice hissed in my ear, no longer coming from the instrument but from inside my own head. "We will make music that will last forever. Your hands are mine now." In desperation, I slammed the keyboard lid down on my own fingers. The pain was excruciating, but it broke the entity's concentration. I felt its grip on my mind loosen slightly, enough for me to stagger away from the bench. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint moonlight through the windows. In that moment of freedom, I understood what I needed to do. This wasn't about completing the restoration, it was about reversing it. With my uninjured hand, I grabbed my wire cutters from my tool bag and lunged for the pianoforte. The invisible force slammed me against the wall, but I fought through the pressure, crawling back to the instrument. The heartbeat sound had become erratic, frantic. I reached the piano and, with a strength born of terror, tore at the strings I had so carefully installed, severing them one by one. Each broken string released a high-pitched wail, like a scream. The temperature in the room fluctuated wildly, freezing cold one moment, stifling hot the next. The invisible presence thrashed around the room, overturning furniture, shattering the windows. I continued cutting strings until my hands were sliced and bleeding, the pain in my crushed fingers almost unbearable. But with each string I cut, the entity's power seemed to diminish. The heartbeat grew fainter, irregular. When I cut the final string, that high A I had just tuned, an unearthly howl filled the room, a sound of such despair and rage that I curled into a ball on the floor, covering my ears. The pianoforte gave one final violent shudder, then split down the middle, its wooden case cracking open like a rib cage. Silence fell again, but different this time. Normal, natural silence, not the dense, fabric-like quiet from before. The presence was gone. I could feel its absence in the air, which no longer carried that unnatural chill. The parlor door swung open on its own. Cradling my injured hand, I stumbled out into the hallway. The front door stood open as well, revealing the night sky beyond. I didn't stop to gather my tools or belongings. I ran to my car and drove down the mountain road in the darkness, my headlights cutting through the fog. I never returned to Elmwood, never answered Blackwood's increasingly threatening phone calls, never collected my fee. My crushed fingers healed, but not properly. My career as a piano tuner is over. I can't bring myself to touch a keyboard. Can't even stand to hear piano music on the radio. Sometimes at night, as I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear faint notes playing at the edge of my consciousness. Fragments of a composition so beautiful it makes my heart ache. And underneath those notes, always, a faint heartbeat in perfect 4/4 time. I wake from these episodes gasping for air, my fingers moving of their own accord, as if playing invisible keys. And though I've moved 3 times since that night at Elmwood, I keep finding small things out of place in my apartment. A book moved from where I left it, a chair turned slightly, and most disturbing of all, my alarm clock occasionally reset to play at precisely 4:44 a.m. I don't own a piano, but sometimes in the silence of my room, I swear I can hear one being tuned. Story 3. The first time I heard the ocean inside my office, I was already too late. The cylinder had chosen me, not the other way around, and what flows from water to paper to mind cannot be undone. Some maps aren't meant to be read, they're meant to read you. The package arrived on a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the lack of return address. A weathered cardboard box containing a brass-capped cylinder about 18 inches long, wrapped in what appeared to be sailcloth so old it had gone brittle. There was no note, just an envelope containing a deed of gift, transferring ownership to me, Benjamin Harlow, senior cartographer at Northwestern Geographical Institute. The signature at the bottom was a precise, spidery scrawl that spelled out, "Ethorn Collector," nothing more. I specialize in historical oceanic cartography. My office walls are lined with antique projections of the Pacific, forgotten shipping routes, and islands that have since disappeared beneath rising seas. This cylinder was simply another artifact to catalog, or so I thought. What professional wouldn't be curious? The brass cap resisted at first, then yielded with a peculiar sigh that raised the hairs on my forearms. The seal beneath it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, a transparent disc that caught the light like a frozen droplet, thin enough to see the yellowed parchment through it. Not wax, not resin, but something with the refraction of glass and the fluidity of water somehow suspended in time. When I pressed my fingernail against it, it yielded slightly before springing back. My colleague Marcus poked his head in, asking about a symposium deadline. I barely registered his words, my attention fixed on that impossible seal. After he left, I took a brass letter opener and carefully worked it under the edge of the transparent disc. It parted with a soft sound like water receding from sand. The parchment inside slid out with surprising ease, unrolling onto my desk with a rustling whisper. The map that unfurled before me was exquisite, hand-drawn in sepia ink on parchment that felt impossibly soft under my fingers. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard maritime chart of the South Pacific, circa mid-19th century, judging by the projection style. But as I leaned closer, adjusting my glasses, something shifted beneath my gaze. An island, small, roughly crescent-shaped, seemed to elongate slightly, as if breathing. I blinked, attributing the illusion to eye strain. Then it happened again. The coastline pulsed, expanded by perhaps a millimeter, then contracted. My heartbeat quickened as I forced myself to look away, then back again. This time, I didn't blink. The southern peninsula of the island visibly stretched, like watching continental drift in real time. Sweat beaded at my temples, 20 years studying historical maps, and I'd never experienced such a vivid hallucination. I reached for my phone to photograph the anomaly, but the screen showed nothing but ordinary parchment. No movement, no pulsation. Through the camera, the map was perfectly normal. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I set the map down and went to splash cold water on my face in the small bathroom adjoining my office. When I returned, the cylinder had somehow rotated 180 degrees on my desk. More troubling was the seal. The water glass disc I had broken was back in place, intact as if never disturbed. I approached cautiously, picking up the cylinder to examine it. The seal appeared completely undamaged. When I rotated the tube, a sound like distant waves breaking on shore emanated from inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I used the letter opener again to break the seal, which parted with the same aqueous sigh. This time, a different map slid out, this one showing a section of coastline I didn't immediately recognize. The cartographic style was similar, but the landforms were unfamiliar. As I studied it, I noticed tiny notations along the shore, inscribed in minute handwriting. I retrieved my magnifying glass to examine them. Where the drowned walk at midnight. Here the tide runs backward. Entry point. Spring tide, new moon. My mouth went dry. These weren't standard navigational notes. They more closely resembled warnings or instructions. As I moved the magnifying glass across the parchment, I noticed something else. The ink wasn't actually sepia, but a deep, rusty red-brown that glinted with an almost metallic sheen under the light. The overhead fluorescents flickered momentarily. When they stabilized, I noticed the map had changed again. A small archipelago that hadn't been present before now dotted the western edge of the chart. My hands began to tremble as I set the magnifying glass down, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I carefully rolled the map back into the cylinder, noticing as I did that my fingertips left no marks on the parchment. It accepted no oils, no impressions, as if it existed just slightly out of phase with the world around it. When I replaced the brass cap, I heard that sound again. Water receding over pebbles. I set the cylinder in my desk drawer and locked it, pocketing the key. That night, sleep evaded me. My apartment felt suffocating despite the open windows, the air thick and saline. Around 3 a.m, I surrendered to insomnia and returned to my office, telling myself I needed to properly catalog the artifact before presenting it to the Institute's conservation team. The security guard nodded as I signed in, commenting on my dedication. If only he knew the compulsion driving me wasn't academic fervor, but something closer to obsession. My hands shook as I unlocked my office door. The smell hit me first. Brine and decay, like a tidal flat at low ebb. My desk lamp illuminated a bizarre scene. Dozens of tiny droplets, perfectly spherical and transparent like miniature glass beads, were arranged across my desktop in a precise pattern. They caught the light like dewdrops, but didn't roll or merge when I hesitantly touched one. They were solid, cool to the touch, yet appeared liquid. The drawer where I'd locked the cylinder was still secured, the key still in my pocket. Yet the drops formed what was unmistakably a coordinate grid. At each intersection point sat one of the glass water droplets, and connecting them revealed the outline of an island chain I'd never seen on any map. My breath fogged in the suddenly chilled air as I used a ruler to measure the distances between the droplets. Converting to a standard Mercator projection, I plotted the coordinates on my computer. According to every database and satellite image available, these points marked empty ocean between New Zealand and Antarctica, a notorious stretch of the Southern Ocean devoid of land, yet the pattern was unmistakable and familiar. It matched the archipelago that had appeared on the second map, the one that hadn't been there initially. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable rush and retreat of waves, as if the tide were ebbing from somewhere behind my bookcase. The sound grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a whispering that skittered at the edges of comprehension. I spun around, searching for the source, but my office door remained closed, the windows securely latched. The drawer containing the cylinder rattled, the lock turning of its own accord. I stumbled backward as the drawer slid open silently. The cylinder rolled forward and fell to the floor with a thud that seemed to reverberate far longer than it should have. The brass cap unscrewed itself before my eyes, falling away to reveal the waterglass seal glowing with a pale blue phosphorescence. My legs gave way as I collapsed into my chair, unable to tear my gaze from the spectacle. The seal dissolved with a sound like a sigh, and parchment spilled forth, unrolling across the floor of its own volition. This map was different, larger, more detailed, and unmistakably showing a coastline I recognized. The eastern seaboard of Massachusetts, where I'd grown up. But superimposed over familiar harbors and bays were those strange islands from before, as if they existed in the same space but different plane. My computer chimed, startling me. An automatic email notification from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Unusual tidal anomalies reported along the eastern seaboard. Academic inquiry. The email detailed unprecedented fluctuations in sea level recordings at multiple stations, defying both lunar cycles and weather patterns. The phenomenon had begun exactly 24 hours after the cylinder had arrived on my desk. The room temperature plummeted. I could see my breath clouding before me as frost patterns, remarkably similar to coastlines, formed on my computer screen. The whispering grew louder, resolving into words I could almost understand. Something about gates opening, something about water finding its level, something about maps that draw themselves. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly fell from my chair. It was Marcus, his voice tense and confused. He asked if I was seeing the news about the coastal anomalies. Before I could respond, he mentioned that the Institute had received inquiries from government agencies about historical precedents for such phenomena. Then he asked hesitantly if I'd made any progress with that cylinder thing. I hadn't told anyone about the cylinder. Cold sweat drenched my shirt as I stammered some excuse and ended the call. My gaze returned to the map on the floor, where the ink now glistened wetly, as if freshly applied. The archipelago of impossible islands had grown larger, spreading across the familiar coastline like an infection. I grabbed the edge of the parchment, intending to roll it up and return it to the cylinder. But the moment my fingers touched it, images flooded my mind. Vast underwater cities with architecture that defied Euclidean geometry. Beings that swam through both water and land as if they were identical mediums. And maps. Countless maps covering the walls of a circular chamber, each one showing a different version of Earth's oceans. My hands came away wet, not with water, but with something that refracted light like the seal had, as if reality itself had become liquid at the point of contact. The droplets clung to my fingertips, impossible to wipe away. I staggered to the bathroom, desperate to wash whatever this was from my skin. But the faucet yielded not water but sand, fine and gray, pouring endlessly into the sink. In the mirror, my reflection rippled as if viewed through disturbed water. Back in my office, the map had changed again. Now it showed my exact location, the Institute, my office, even my name written in that same spidery handwriting. But surrounding the building was no longer Cambridge, but open water, with those impossible islands encircling the structure like predators. The sound of waves grew deafening. Water began seeping under my door, not flooding in, but rising impossibly from the floor itself, forming a perfectly even layer that spread across the room without touching my shoes. It was an inch deep, then 2, yet I remained dry despite standing in the middle of it. The water was a medium, not a physical presence, a translation layer between realities. In that moment of clarity, I understood what the cylinder truly was. Not a container for maps, but a key, a tool for repositioning geographical realities. The cartographer doesn't just document the world, he helps define it. These maps weren't representations, but alterations, each one shifting something fundamental about the relationship between land and sea. The cylinder rolled across the floor, coming to rest against my foot. The water glass seal had reformed again, glowing more intensely now. My hands moved of their own accord, picking it up, feeling its strange weight. I understood with perfect clarity that I had choices. Break the seal again and allow whatever was happening to continue. Or, I looked back at my computer screen, now showing satellite imagery of the eastern coastline. Meteorologists were baffled by pressure systems that didn't behave according to known physics. Coastal communities reported tides that came in, but didn't retreat. With trembling hands, I raised the cylinder above my head and brought it down hard against the edge of my desk. The brass dented but held. Again I struck it, again and again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. On the seventh blow, a crack appeared along the cylinder's length. The water beneath my feet surged violently, splashing up to my knees, though I remained inexplicably dry. The crack widened, spilling forth not parchment but pure light, blinding in its intensity. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo of rage or pain. I couldn't tell which. My ears popped as if I'd descended to crushing depths, then silence, complete and absolute. When my vision cleared, my office was dry. The cylinder lay broken on the floor, empty. The maps, the glass water droplets, all gone. Only a faint smell of salt remained. I've checked every scientific database, every maritime report. The coastal anomalies ceased at the exact moment I broke the cylinder. No trace remains of the impossible islands, at least not in any conventional record. But my dreams are now filled with underwater spires and non-Euclidean architecture. When I shower, the water forms momentary patterns on the tile that look like coastlines I've never seen. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of transparent water-like droplets forming coordinates on my desk. Most disturbing of all, the scars on my hands from breaking the cylinder weep not blood, but clear fluid that hardens into glass-like beads. And each night, I swear the sound of waves grows louder in my apartment, though I live 30 miles inland. The cylinder may be destroyed, but I fear the key has merged with the keymaster. I've begun drawing my own maps now, compulsively, maps of places that cannot exist. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I hear a whispering that grows more intelligible by the day. The map is not the territory. The map creates the territory, and the water always finds its level. Story 4. And the first time I saw the water moving upward, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. The fluorescent tubes in the third sublevel garage had always flickered unpredictably, casting strange shadows across the polished concrete floor. But when I crouched down and watched a puddle shrink from the bottom up, droplets lifting off the surface like gravity had suddenly reversed its grip, I felt the first cold fingers of dread wrap around my spine. My phone's camera captured what my mind refused to process: a fine mist enveloping the luxury vehicles, rotating clockwise with unnatural precision, making the chrome logos and license plates glow with a phosphorescent light that shouldn't exist 3 levels beneath the earth. As property manager of the Obsidian, Milwaukee's most exclusive underground condominium complex, I dealt with flooding, electrical failures, and the occasional entitled resident. But nothing had prepared me for what was happening in the lowest level of our parking structure. The humidity sensors had gone haywire 2 days ago, displaying negative readings that the maintenance crew dismissed as faulty equipment. Being thorough was my reputation, the reason I'd been hired to oversee this $200 million subterranean marvel. So I'd come down alone at 2 a.m. to investigate. Now I wished I hadn't. My breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air as I moved between the rows of BMWs, Teslas, and Maseratis. The concrete pillars seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, as though breathing in perfect rhythm with the swirling mist. The security cameras mounted overhead had captured the phenomenon for 3 consecutive nights, but the footage had been dismissed as digital artifacts or condensation on the lenses. Those explanations felt hollow as I watched another puddle begin to lift, drop by drop, toward the ceiling. The maintenance staff had reported strange noises coming from the ventilation system, metallic clicks and low, resonant hums, but nothing like the sound that now filled my ears. A wet, crackling static that reminded me of ice breaking on a winter lake. Each drop that ascended made a tiny snap as it struck the fluorescent tubes overhead, like raindrops hitting hot metal in reverse. I raised my phone to take another photo when the screen went black. The battery had been at 87% just moments before. A viscous bead of sweat rolled down my neck as I pocketed the useless device and tried to silence my accelerating heartbeat. The elevators were 50 yards away, past 3 more rows of cars, and the electrical substation that powered this level. Just walk, don't run. There's a logical explanation. My shoes squeaked against the concrete as I moved, each step echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. The building plans had highlighted the Obsidian's revolutionary dampening technology, a cutting-edge system designed to isolate each floor from external vibrations and sound. But now every footfall reverberated as if the garage were expanding with each step. Then I saw them. Footprints forming on the dry concrete ahead of me. Not from someone walking. These appeared from nowhere, materializing as though an invisible presence were approaching. Wet impressions shimmering under the fluorescent lights, perfectly formed heel-to-toe imprints that stopped precisely 12 feet from where I stood, frozen. My throat constricted as a cold sweat broke across my forehead. The logical part of my brain searched desperately for explanations. Water seeping up through the concrete, some bizarre pressure phenomenon, an elaborate prank by residents who resented the recent increase in maintenance fees. None of these thoughts could explain why the impressions began to dry from the bottom up, just like the puddles. The garage had 5 emergency exits, each leading to reinforced stairwells designed to withstand anything short of a nuclear attack. The nearest was behind me, perhaps 30 yards. I backed away from the vanishing footprints, my peripheral vision catching glimpses of movement around the luxury vehicles. The mist had thickened, forming distinct tendrils that coiled around side view mirrors and antenna bases. Each car now sat in its own cocoon of swirling vapor, the logos and license plates glowing more intensely than before. A Mercedes emblem pulsed like a tiny blue star, its light reflecting off the droplets rising from beneath it. The rhythmic glow matched my racing pulse, or perhaps my heart had synchronized with it without my conscious awareness. The thought made me dizzy, and I steadied myself against a concrete pillar, jerking my hand away when I felt its surface vibrating with a subtle current. The Obsidian had been marketed as the future of luxury living, a haven for the wealthy seeking escape from Milwaukee's increasingly extreme weather events. 3 levels underground, we were supposed to be isolated from the outside world's chaos. What if we dug too deep? What if we'd breached something that should have remained sealed? The property developers had been suspiciously vague about what had occupied this downtown site before construction began. Old newspaper archives had mentioned a research facility in the 1970s, but specific details were surprisingly scarce. Our geological surveys had shown unusual mineral deposits beneath the site. Nothing dangerous, just anomalous formations that required special construction techniques. These thoughts raced through my mind as I backed toward the emergency exit, unable to tear my eyes away from the intensifying phenomenon. The rising droplets had increased in number, hundreds now lifting simultaneously across the garage floor. They moved faster now, striking the ceiling with audible impacts that formed a discordant percussion. The humidity readout on the wall, which had registered negative numbers for days, now displayed rapidly changing symbols that resembled no numerical system I recognized. My back finally struck the emergency exit's push bar, but the door didn't budge. I spun around and shoved with both hands, the metal cold enough to burn my palms. The electronic lock showed green. It should have opened, but the door remained fixed as though welded shut from the other side. Panic surged through my chest as I slammed my shoulder against it repeatedly, each impact sending shockwaves of pain down my arm. The crackling sounds intensified behind me. When I turned, the mist had changed. No longer content to swirl around individual vehicles, it now flowed between them, forming currents and eddies that moved with disturbing purpose. The phosphorescent glow had spread from the metal emblems to outline entire cars, creating ghostly duplicates that hovered inches above their solid counterparts. My mind flashed to the recent complaints from residents: unexplained power fluctuations, electronics failing without cause, persistent low-frequency hums that disrupted sleep. Management had blamed the city's aging power grid and promised to install additional filters. We'd dismissed reports of disorientation and momentary memory lapses as symptoms of the residents' advancing age. The average Obsidian dweller was over 60, wealthy enough to afford our astronomical fees. What if they'd been experiencing genuine effects from whatever was happening here? The third sublevel had always been colder than the ones above it, a fact our engineers attributed to its proximity to the water table. They'd installed additional dehumidifiers after residents complained about condensation on their vehicles. Those units had failed spectacularly last week. Their circuits fused in ways our maintenance team couldn't explain. Another emergency exit waited on the far side of the garage. I pushed away from the locked door and began moving along the perimeter wall, keeping my back to the concrete. The mist parted before me like a sentient entity, forming a corridor that both invited and threatened. My legs trembled with each step, muscles tensed for flight even as I forced myself to move deliberately. The fluorescent tubes overhead were changing color, their sterile white light gradually shifting toward a pale blue that reminded me of deep-water ice. The temperature continued to drop, my breath forming thicker clouds with each exhale. The concrete floor beneath my feet no longer felt solid. Each step produced a subtle give, as though I were walking across a membrane rather than engineered stone. I'd nearly reached the midpoint of the garage when I heard it. A low, resonant tone that vibrated through my chest cavity. Not mechanical, not electronic, but something organic and vast. The sound pulsed in perfect sync with the glowing emblems, which now blinked like beacons across the darkening space. My phone vibrated in my pocket, impossible given its dead battery. I pulled it out to find the screen illuminated with the same symbols now displayed on the humidity sensor. The camera activated without my input, lens focusing on the center of the garage where the mist now formed a perfect cylinder extending from floor to ceiling. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself moving toward it. Not by choice. My legs carried me forward as though pulled by unseen hands. The mist parted around me, cold tendrils brushing against my face with the texture of wet silk. The garage lights dimmed further until only the phosphorescent glow of the vehicle emblems provided illumination, their pulsing intensifying with each step I took. At the center of the garage, directly beneath the main ventilation shaft, the concrete floor had changed. What had been solid now rippled like the surface of a pond, concentric circles expanding outward from a central point. Yet it remained solid beneath my feet, a contradiction my mind struggled to reconcile. The air pressure changed abruptly, my ears popping painfully as a vacuum seemed to form around me. The rising droplets accelerated, no longer individual beads but continuous streams flowing upward with increasing force. My hair stood on end, not from static electricity but pulled toward the ceiling, as though gravity itself had reversed. That's when I understood what was happening, or at least what my terrified mind could rationalize. The boundary between our world and something else had thinned in this place. Whether through the unique mineral composition beneath the building, the specific depth of our excavation, or some cosmic alignment I couldn't comprehend, the obsidian had been built at a juncture where physical laws became malleable. The residents' complaints suddenly made horrible sense. The memory lapses, the disorientation, the persistent fatigue, all symptoms of existing in a space where reality itself was unstable. We'd dismissed an elderly resident's claim that she'd seen her late husband standing at the foot of her bed, his form composed of what she described as luminous mist. Another had reported waking to find his bedroom mirror reflecting a version of his condominium that was architecturally identical but composed of blue-black stone that seemed to absorb light. My phone screen flashed brightly, the incomprehensible symbols now arranging themselves into recognizable patterns that still conveyed no meaning my conscious mind could grasp. Yet some deeper part of me responded, a primal recognition that sent waves of cold dread cascading through my body. These weren't random glitches, they were communication attempts. Something was reaching through. The cylindrical formation of mist began to narrow at its center, constricting like an hourglass, or the pupil of an enormous eye adjusting to light. Within the constriction, darkness gathered, not the absence of light, but something more fundamental, a void that suggested absence of everything our reality contained. My body trembled uncontrollably now, not from cold, but from proximity to something my mind couldn't process. Primitive survival instincts screamed for flight, but my muscles refused to respond. I remained fixed in place while the darkness within the mist took form. Not solid, not even properly visible, but undeniably present. It unfurled like a flower composed of negative space, each petal extending outward before folding back in complex geometries. The movement created patterns that hurt to observe, angles that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space overlapping and intersecting. My vision blurred as tears streamed down my face, my brain's desperate attempt to protect itself from what it was being forced to witness. And then it spoke, not in words, not in sound, but in sensations that bypassed my ears and materialized directly in my consciousness. Cold pressure against my thoughts, probing tendrils that slithered through memories and emotions with clinical detachment. Images flashed before me, the obsidian's foundation being poured over strange mineral formations, engineers noting anomalous readings but proceeding under pressure from investors, the first residents reporting dreams of submersion in luminous blue depths. These weren't my memories. They belonged to the building itself, or to whatever had awakened beneath it. The pressure in my mind intensified, sorting through my knowledge of the building systems, ventilation that connected all three sublevels, water pipes that ran through central columns, electrical conduits that formed a grid beneath the concrete floors. I understood with sudden, horrifying clarity that it was learning our infrastructure, mapping pathways through which it could spread. With tremendous effort, I managed to raise my arm, fingers trembling as I activated my phone's flash. The bright LED cut through the mist momentarily, disrupting the perfect formation. The pressure in my mind receded slightly, the entity recoiling from the simple technology. Not from the light itself, I realized, but from the abrupt change, the introduction of chaotic elements into its carefully orchestrated emergence. Chaos, disruption, randomness, these were anathema to whatever was attempting to manifest. The realization gave me enough mental freedom to take one stumbling step backward, breaking the perfect alignment it had established. The mist swirled in agitation, the phosphorescent glow intensifying around the vehicles as though in response to anger or frustration. I remembered the building's emergency protocols, specifically the fire suppression system. The third sublevel garage used a high-pressure water mist system rather than traditional sprinklers, more effective for vehicle fires and less damaging to the luxury cars. The control panel was mounted near the electrical substation, 20 yards away. Each step away from the central manifestation became easier than the last, as though its influence weakened with distance or its attention had turned elsewhere. I moved as quickly as my trembling legs allowed, navigating between vehicles whose emblems now pulsed with angry red light. The suppression system's control panel required a key I carried on my ring, standard procedure for the property manager. My fingers felt numb as I fumbled with the lock, the key slipping from my sweat-slicked hand twice before I managed to insert it. The panel opened to reveal a simple interface, system status indicators and a large red button protected by a plastic cover. Behind me, the mist formation had begun to collapse, the cylindrical structure giving way to chaotic swirls that expanded outward with increasing speed. The darkness at its center remained, but now it stretched and distorted, reaching tendrils toward me with unmistakable purpose. The vehicle emblems flashed in furious patterns, their glow intensifying until the logos seemed to detach from the cars themselves, hovering inches above the metal surfaces. I flipped the plastic cover and slammed my palm against the red button. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the ceiling erupted with a deafening hiss as thousands of high-pressure nozzles activated simultaneously, filling the garage with a fine water mist that fell downward. Natural, proper, obeying the physical laws that should never have been violated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the manifestation. Where the falling water met the rising droplets, tiny flashes of blue-white light erupted, like miniature lightning strikes. The mist formation collapsed entirely, the darkness at its center shuddering violently before fragmenting into smaller voids that winked out of existence one by one. The phosphorescent glow faded from the vehicle emblems, returning them to mundane metal and plastic. The swirling mist thinned and dissipated, leaving only the artificial fog of the fire suppression system. The temperature rose rapidly, returning to the garage's normal cool dampness, rather than the bone-deep cold that had pervaded it moments before. I stood trembling beside the control panel as the water continued to fall, soaking through my clothes and washing away the cold sweat of terror. My phone screen had returned to normal, battery indicator showing 87% as though nothing had happened. The humidity sensor on the wall displayed a perfectly reasonable 68%, high due to the activated sprinklers, but no longer negative or displaying incomprehensible symbols. When the water finally shut off automatically after its programmed 5-minute cycle, I remained motionless, listening intently for any sign that the phenomenon persisted. The garage was silent, save for water dripping from cars and ceiling, following gravity's proper direction. The fluorescent lights had returned to their normal white glow, revealing nothing but an empty parking garage and a lot of wet luxury vehicles. I knew I should document everything, file reports, perhaps evacuate the building until a thorough investigation could be conducted. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me this prestigious position, began constructing explanations. A gas leak causing hallucinations, stress-induced perceptual distortions, perhaps even a minor stroke that had affected my vision and cognition. But deeper down, where primal instincts resided, I understood what had happened. The obsidian had been built at a place where the membrane between worlds had grown thin. Our excavation, our presence, our electromagnetic systems had created conditions that allowed something to begin crossing over. The water, natural, flowing according to proper physical laws, had disrupted its attempt. But for how long? I made my way to the elevator, each step splashing through puddles that remained firmly on the ground. As the doors closed and the car began its ascent, I noticed small droplets of water on the ceiling. They clung there unnaturally, defying gravity in a way that might be dismissed as capillary action or surface tension. But I knew better. I watched as one droplet detached and began to rise toward the light fixture overhead, followed by another and another. Whatever had begun in the third sublevel was spreading upward, following the paths I'd inadvertently revealed through my knowledge of the building's systems. It was learning, adapting, finding new ways to manipulate our reality. The fire suppression system had disrupted its manifestation but hadn't stopped its influence. As property manager of the Obsidian, I had access to the building's complete blueprints, maintenance schedules, and resident information. I knew every system, every weakness, every potential point of failure. In trying to understand what was happening, I had given it everything it needed. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby level. Through the glass walls that surrounded the Obsidian's atrium, I could see rain falling outside. Normal, natural rain, obeying the fundamental laws of our world. But as I stepped into the silent lobby, I noticed small puddles forming on the marble floor beneath perfectly dry ceiling tiles. And in those puddles, tiny droplets beginning to rise. Story 5. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was fatigue. The second time, I blamed the dim lighting and my aging eyes. By the third time, I couldn't deny that something was fundamentally wrong with the Bellamy Theater, or with me. The renovation project was only in its second week, when I began to notice that the grand staircase in the central vestibule didn't behave like stairs should. Architecture isn't supposed to rebel against the laws of physics, yet here I was, clutching a brass railing that seemed alive beneath my palm. my footsteps betrayed by wood that pushed back. I never wanted this job. Interim watchman at a century-old Art Nouveau theater wasn't exactly on my career vision board, but after the layoffs at the manufacturing plant and 3 months of rejected applications, I needed something, anything, to keep the creditors at bay. The Bellamy's owners needed someone on site overnight while the daytime crews renovated the once grand performance hall. A simple arrangement, 12 hours of solitude, a thermos of coffee, and rounds every 2 hours to check for burst pipes or signs of break-ins. The pay was modest, but immediate. Nothing to it, the project manager had assured me with a dismissive wave, handing over a ring of antiquated keys that weighed heavy in my pocket. Just keep the vagrants out and make sure nothing catches fire. He hadn't mentioned the stairs, of course, or the lamps, or the whispers. The Bellamy had been the crown jewel of downtown when it opened in 1911, hosting opera companies and vaudeville acts before declining into a second-run movie house and finally closing 20 years ago. Its facade still maintained a stubborn elegance, with sinuous metal details and stained glass that caught the afternoon light. Artistic flourishes from an era before function crushed form. Inside, decades of neglect had transformed grandeur into decay, peeling gilt, water-stained plaster, and the perpetual smell of mildew that no amount of industrial cleaners could mask. My first week passed uneventfully. I patrolled with my flashlight, documented minor issues for the day crew, and spent the quiet hours reading paperbacks in the manager's office. I avoided the theater's auditorium with its gaping stage and rows of seats shrouded in drop cloths like patient ghosts. The place felt melancholy but ordinary. I was even starting to appreciate the solitude after years on a noisy factory floor. Then came Monday of the second week. I was making my 2 a.m. rounds when I decided to check the upper balcony where workers had been reinforcing railings. I approached the central staircase, a sweeping wooden curve that dominated the vestibule, and began my ascent. 6 steps up, a curious sensation overtook me. Despite continuing to climb, I felt a subtle resistance, as if walking against an invisible current. My legs grew unreasonably heavy. The handrail seemed to glide the wrong way under my grip, creating the distinct impression that I was descending while climbing. Vertigo seized me. I stopped, closed my eyes, and took several deep breaths. When I looked again, I was somehow 2 steps lower than where I'd stopped. I attributed it to misperception in the poor light and pressed on, gripping the railing tighter. The sensation intensified. The tread seemed to push against my feet with a gentle centrifugal force, like a reversed escalator. My heart pounded as I struggled upward against resistance that shouldn't exist. After what felt like climbing 20 steps, far more than the actual number, I finally reached the mezzanine level, sweating and disoriented. I told myself it was an inner ear issue, perhaps the start of a viral infection. I even made a doctor's appointment for the following week. Yet when I descended an hour later, new impossibilities awaited. The stairs, which had fought my ascent, now seemed eager to accelerate my descent. Each step down was slightly shorter than the previous, creating a sickening sensation of falling much further than the actual distance. By the time I should have reached the ground floor, I was convinced I'd descended well into some non-existent basement level. Panic bloomed in my chest until I turned and looked back up the staircase, only to find myself exactly at the vestibule level where I'd started. No subterranean depths, just the ordinary ground floor. I spent the remainder of that shift in the office, door locked, convincing myself I'd experienced some sort of spatial disorientation due to the building's unusual acoustics and my own exhaustion. When morning came, I said nothing to the arriving workers. What could I say? That the stairs were playing tricks? That the building was somehow spatially wrong? They'd think I was drinking on the job. Tuesday night, I avoided the main staircase entirely, using the utility stairs at the back of the building for my rounds. But at midnight, another anomaly demanded my attention. The ornate gas lamps that lined the vestibule, long since converted to electric but maintaining their vintage appearance, began to flicker despite being powered off. Inside their glass globes, non-existent flames wavered and danced, casting weak pools of amber light that shouldn't be possible. I checked the breaker panels, finding all switches for the vestibule fixtures in the off position. When I returned, the phantom illumination continued, each lamp pulsing gently as if breathing. I approached one hesitantly, feeling a chill as my hand detected no heat through the glass. The light inside moved like flame but generated no warmth. I unscrewed one globe with trembling fingers, expecting the light to dissipate, but it remained, now floating freely without its container, an impossible fire burning in open air. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of paint cans. The noise echoed through the building's hollow spaces, returning distorted as though filtered through water. That's when I first heard the humming. It wasn't mechanical, not the building's ancient boiler or the temporary generators outside. This was melodic, almost vocal, a tuneless drone that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I followed it instinctively, my flashlight beam cutting through dust-filled air as the humming led me toward the auditorium, the one place I'd been unconsciously avoiding. The massive double doors were unlocked, though I was certain I'd secured them earlier. They swung open at my touch with well-oiled silence, revealing the cavernous space beyond. My light seemed swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only small patches of the drop-cloth-covered seats and the proscenium arch looming above the stage. The humming grew more distinct here, vibrating in my chest cavity like bass notes from powerful speakers. I asked if anyone was there, my voice thin and uncertain. The humming paused briefly before resuming at a slightly higher pitch. My skin prickled with gooseflesh as I advanced down the center aisle, dust motes swimming in my flashlight beam. The stage stood 8 feet above floor level, its curtains removed for cleaning, leaving a gaping black void. As I approached, I noticed something odd about the stage floor. It seemed to undulate subtly, wooden planks rising and falling in gentle waves. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were deceiving me. When I looked again, the stage was still, but the air above it shimmered like heat waves over summer asphalt. The humming localized to directly overhead, drawing my gaze upward to the domed ceiling where elaborate plasterwork depicted classical muses. In the inadequate beam of my flashlight, their faces appeared distorted, mouths stretched too wide, eyes too deep. One figure in particular, a woman with flowing hair, holding what might have been a lyre, seemed to regard me directly, her head tilted at an impossible angle. My rational mind supplied explanations: stress, sleep deprivation, perhaps mold spores affecting my cognitive function. I backed away, promising myself I'd request a transfer to day shift, citing health concerns if necessary. As I retreated toward the doors, the humming followed, maintaining a consistent distance behind me. Something brushed against my neck, a cobweb, I desperately told myself, not phantom fingers. The next night, I came prepared with a digital recorder, a carbon monoxide detector, and a stubborn determination to document whatever was happening. The project manager had denied my request for reassignment, with a condescending reminder that night watchmen were difficult to find at the salary they offered. He suggested I bring a radio for company if the silence was getting to me. I began my shift with a systematic inspection, recording baseline readings throughout the building. The carbon monoxide levels were normal. I took photographs of the staircase from various angles, careful documentation for what I was increasingly certain was an anomaly beyond my understanding. At 11:30 p.m., I set the recorder on the bottom step of the main staircase and began climbing. The resistance began immediately, stronger than before. I pushed against it, leaning forward like walking into strong wind. My breathing became labored despite the minimal physical exertion. Halfway up, I froze as a reflection caught my eye. In the decorative mirror on the landing, my ascending figure appeared to be moving downward, my steps reversed like badly edited film. I forced myself to continue, sweat soaking my shirt despite the building's perpetual chill. At the top, I retrieved my recorder and rewound it. The playback contained my footsteps and labored breathing, but beneath them ran another sound, a faint scratching, like phonograph needles on empty vinyl, punctuated by what could have been words in a language too fragmentary to identify. I descended with my eyes closed, counting steps. There should have been exactly 22 treads between the mezzanine and ground floor. I counted 37 before my foot met level ground. When I opened my eyes, I was indeed at the vestibule, the spatial distortion resolving itself once again into mundane reality. My legs trembled with the adrenaline aftermath. The gas lamps were lit again with their heatless, impossible flames. I approached one and spoke directly to it, asking what was happening, feeling only partially ridiculous. The flame elongated toward me like a curious finger before resuming its natural shape. I laughed nervously, the sound echoing back at me with a quality that wasn't quite right, as though someone else had laughed simultaneously, their timing milliseconds off from mine. I retreated to the office but found no sanctuary there. The room had changed subtly, the desk 2 inches further from the wall than I remembered, the chair at a different angle than I'd left it. My coffee thermos was open, though I was certain I'd closed it. Small discrepancies that together formed a picture of wrongness. The humming began again, now accompanied by a soft tapping from inside the walls. Not the random settling of an old building, but rhythmic, intentional. I pressed my ear against the floral-patterned wallpaper and heard what sounded like fingernails moving behind the plaster. When I pulled away, the wallpaper retained a slight indentation where nothing had visibly pressed against it. I considered leaving, simply walking out and never returning, abandoning both job and final paycheck. But a strange compulsion kept me there, a need to understand what was happening. The project manager had mentioned the theater's storied past when hiring me, boasting about famous performances and illustrious careers launched on its stage. He hadn't mentioned tragedies or accidents, though surely a building this old had witnessed its share of misfortunes. I wondered what history lay buried beneath the renovations, what memories remained impressed upon the physical space like grooves on a record. At 3 a.m., I forced myself to return to the auditorium, drawn by the intensifying hum that had become almost musical. The doors swung open before I touched them, revealing the space transformed. Though no actual lights were on, the room glowed with diffuse illumination that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The drop cloths had been removed from the seats, or appeared to have been, revealing faded red velvet. The stage was no longer empty, but set with the suggestion of scenery, translucent flats depicting a grand salon, furnishings like mirages that sharpened and faded as I stared. I felt eyes upon me, hundreds of them, though the seats remained empty. The pressure of observation prickled across my skin as I moved down the aisle. The humming organized itself into a distant melody played on strings and woodwinds, an orchestra heard through thick walls. As I approached the stage, I noticed the pit area before it was no longer covered but open, a dark rectangular void. From its depths rose the music, along with the subtle scent of grease paint and perfume. Logic told me to back away, but curiosity propelled me forward until I stood at the edge, peering down into blackness that seemed deeper than the actual dimensions allowed. The music crescendoed, and with it came a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grab a seat back to remain upright. The pit appeared to expand below me, its darkness spreading outward like spilled ink. Within its depths, shadows moved with purpose, not random patterns but deliberate choreography, figures performing for an audience I couldn't see. The seat beneath my steadying hand warmed suddenly, as though recently vacated. I yanked my fingers away, heart pounding as I backed toward the exit. The music followed, changing quality to something discordant and urgent. The doors, which had opened so readily before, now remained stubbornly closed despite my frantic pushing. Trapped, I turned to face the theater again, my flashlight beam cutting ineffectually through the strange ambient glow. On the stage, a figure stood where none had been before, indistinct, more suggestion than substance, a human shape composed of shadow and refracted light. It made no move toward me but simply watched, its attention an almost physical pressure. The humming localized to this figure, emanating from where a mouth would be. I called out, demanding to know who was there, my voice cracking with strain. The figure raised an arm, pointing not at me but toward the wall to my right. There, previously hidden by shadows, a small door stood ajar, one I'd never noticed during my rounds. Maintenance access, perhaps, or storage. With the main doors still sealed, it offered the only exit. I approached cautiously, torn between fear of the beckoning passage and the watchful presence on stage. The door opened onto a narrow corridor lined with peeling show posters from decades past. A draft pulled from behind me, drawing me forward. The passageway should have led to the theater's exterior based on my mental map of the building, but after several turns, I found myself descending a staircase that spiraled gently downward, nothing like the utilitarian service stairs I'd used before. These steps were narrow, the ceiling low enough to require me to stoop, the walls pressing in on both sides. Unlike the main staircase, these steps didn't fight my descent but rather hastened it, each tread tilting subtly forward to propel me downward. I ran my hand along the wall for balance and felt not plaster but something organic, warm and slightly yielding beneath my fingers. I yanked my hand away, using my flashlight to examine the surface. The wallpaper pattern seemed to shift as I watched, floral designs elongating and contracting like slow-motion film of blooming flowers. The stairwell ended abruptly at a door identical to the one I'd entered. Fearing I'd walked in a circle, I hesitated before turning the tarnished brass knob. It opened onto the vestibule where my night's journey had begun, but subtly altered, as though I were seeing it through warped glass. The dimensions seemed wrong, the ceiling too high, the walls curved where they should be straight. The gas lamps burned brighter now, their impossible flames casting long shadows that moved independently of their sources. The main staircase dominated the space as always, but now appeared to be constructed of something other than wood, something reflective and mutable that caught the lamplight and swirled with colors beneath its surface. As I watched, the steps rippled like disturbed water, then settled again into solid form. I understood then what was happening, or thought I did. The Bellamy wasn't just a building, it was a threshold. The renovations had disturbed something, awakened something, or perhaps merely thinned the barrier between what was and what might be. The theater existed in multiple states simultaneously, past and present overlaid, potential futures bleeding through worn spots in reality. The humming returned, now resolving into words just below the threshold of comprehension. Almost English, but vowels wrong, consonants stretched. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement on the stairs, the suggestion of figures ascending and descending simultaneously, temporal echoes of everyone who had ever walked those steps. Among them, almost transparent but growing more solid as I focused, was a figure I recognized with sickening clarity. Myself, moving both up and down the staircase in endless repetition. My doppelganger turned to face me, its expression a mirror of my own horror. Our eyes locked across impossible distance, and in that moment, the theater seemed to hold its breath. The humming ceased, the phantom flames froze, time suspended between 1 second and the next. Then reality convulsed, architectural space folding in on itself like origami, angles that should never connect suddenly adjacent. I found myself on the stairs, not standing but sprawled as though I'd fallen, though I had no memory of mounting the steps. Above me, my double looked down with an expression not of fear but pity before dissolving into the shadows. The staircase shuddered beneath me, steps flattening and reforming, the handrail flowing like liquid before resolidifying. I scrambled to my feet and descended in a controlled fall, no longer caring about impossible physics or spatial distortions, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. I hit the vestibule floor running and didn't stop until I'd burst through the front doors into the blessed normality of the street. Dawn was breaking, painting the city in comforting grays and blues. I gulped cold air, hands on knees, as a passing jogger gave me a curious glance. Behind me, the Bellamy's facade stood silent and ordinary, early sunlight gleaming on its stained glass accents. I never returned for my final paycheck or the paperback I'd left in the office. When the theater reopened 6 months later after successful renovations, I avoided the gala celebration despite its coverage in local media. The project manager left 2 voicemails asking about my abrupt departure, then nothing. Life moved on. I found factory work 2 towns over. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear that humming. Distant, but distinct. And in my bathroom mirror, if I glance too quickly, I occasionally catch my reflection moving a half second after I've stopped. In those moments, I understand that I didn't truly escape. I merely extended the threshold. The Bellamy released me, but it kept something in exchange. Some fragment of myself still ascending and descending those impossible stairs, trapped in the overlap between what is and what cannot be. And sometimes I feel it calling that missing piece home. Story 6. The first time I saw them, I convinced myself it was just fatigue, the mind's way of filling empty spaces with familiar shapes. But empty spaces aren't supposed to move. Empty spaces don't track your movements, and they certainly don't breathe. My name is Daniel Mercer, curator of contemporary photography at the Wexler Museum of Visual Arts. When the board approved my proposal for Reflections Photography in the Digital Age, I was ecstatic. 3 months of work culminating in what would be the most innovative exhibition of my career. The museum's newly renovated West Wing featured a remarkable chamber, walls lined with polished metal panels that the architect had described as living mirrors. The space was meant to create an infinite reflection of the artwork, allowing viewers to experience photography from countless perspectives simultaneously. That was the theory anyway. I arrived early that Monday, 2 weeks before opening night. The installation team had finished mounting the panel system over the weekend, and I was eager to begin arranging the collection. The morning light streamed through the skylight, dancing across the metallic surfaces. Except the surfaces weren't reflecting anything. Instead of the expected mirror finish, the walls had taken on a flat, matte gray appearance. I approached one panel, running my fingers across its surface. Cold, perfectly smooth, but absorbing all light like some impossible material. I called maintenance immediately. The head technician arrived within minutes, his face contorting in confusion as he examined the panels. He insisted they had been reflective during installation, brilliantly mirrored surfaces that had required careful handling to avoid fingerprints. We checked the manufacturer's specifications, confirming the panels were aircraft-grade aluminum with a mirror finish. The technician mentioned something about molecular structure changes being impossible without extreme heat, all while avoiding eye contact, clearly unsettled by what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing. After he left, promising to consult with the manufacturer, I remained in the gallery, attempting to work around this unexpected development. Perhaps the matte finish could serve the exhibition concept in a different way. I began testing various lighting configurations, plotting where each piece would be displayed. As afternoon faded to evening, I found myself alone in the museum, most staff having departed hours earlier. The security guard had made his rounds, nodding respectfully before informing me he'd be stationed at the front desk if needed. I preferred working in solitude, especially when planning exhibition layouts. Testing the dramatic effect of different lighting on the photographs required complete darkness between adjustments. I switched off the overhead lights, plunging the gallery into blackness so complete I couldn't see my hand before my face. I waited for my eyes to adjust before activating the first spotlight. That's when I saw it. A brief flicker in my peripheral vision, like a camera flash. I turned, but encountered only darkness. I attributed it to retinal afterimages and continued working. Then it happened again. A silent burst of light that left no illumination, yet somehow registered in my vision. I stood motionless, waiting. A third flash, but this time I could make out a shape within it. A negative image, like an old photographic plate, showing what appeared to be a human silhouette. It lasted only a fraction of a second before dissolving into the darkness. My heart rate accelerated, a cold sweat forming at my temples. I tried convincing myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of sensory deprivation. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual. Breathing deeply to calm my racing pulse, I continued working, refusing to acknowledge what I'd seen. Over the next hour, the phenomena intensified. Flashes appeared with increasing frequency, each revealing more detailed negative images. People walking slowly through the darkness, their forms rendered in stark white against black, like photographic negatives frozen in air. They moved in paths that always seemed to circle around my position, never approaching directly, but never moving away either. My hands trembled as I activated the main lighting system. The gallery flooded with light, and the images vanished instantly. I stood there, heart hammering against my ribcage, mouth dry, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Sleep deprivation, stress, overwork. Any explanation seemed preferable to what my senses had registered. I recalled the thermal imaging camera in my office, part of a planned display on infrared photography. Perhaps it could detect abnormalities in the room. I retrieved it, hands still shaking slightly, and began scanning the gallery. The display showed normal temperature readings until I pointed it at the area where I'd seen the flashes. There, unmistakably, were heat signatures, human-shaped thermal imprints moving in circular patterns despite the room being empty. My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. I tracked these heat signatures as they wove around the room, always maintaining distance but clearly aware of my presence. They adjusted their paths whenever I moved, keeping the same relative distance. I needed documentation, evidence that I wasn't hallucinating. I set up a tripod and mounted both a standard digital camera and the thermal imager, programming them to take simultaneous exposures at 10-second intervals. After positioning them to capture most of the gallery, I shut off the lights. The flashes returned immediately. With each burst, I caught glimpses of more figures, their features becoming increasingly defined. Not just silhouettes now, but faces, expressionless, eyes wide and hollow, mouths slightly open as if frozen mid-breath. They moved with deliberate slowness, their paths more complex than I'd initially perceived, forming patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. My skin prickled with gooseflesh, each hair standing on end. A pervasive cold had settled in the room, my breath now visible in faint clouds. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in minutes, defying the building's climate control system. After 30 minutes, that felt like hours. I reactivated the lights and examined the cameras. The digital camera had captured nothing unusual, just empty gallery spaces. But the thermal imager told a different story. Each frame showed heat signatures moving in precise patterns, creating a complex choreography around where I had stood. Most disturbing were the moments when several forms converged, their thermal signatures intensifying, as if communicating or transferring energy. I downloaded the images to my laptop, hands trembling so violently I mistyped my password twice. The security guard checked on me, noticing my distress. I fabricated an excuse about deadline pressure. Something prevented me from sharing what I'd witnessed. A primal instinct warning that speaking the phenomenon aloud would somehow strengthen it. After he left, I examined the thermal images more carefully. The patterns weren't random. The figures appeared to be tracing shapes on the floor. Shapes that corresponded exactly with the layout I'd been planning for the exhibition. Somehow, they knew precisely where each photograph would be placed, weeks before installation. This realization sent a shock of ice through my veins. Whatever these entities were, they anticipated my intentions, perhaps even influenced them. Had I been unknowingly arranging the exhibition according to their design? The thought made me nauseous, acid burning the back of my throat. I gathered my equipment hastily, unable to remain in that space any longer. As I reached the doorway, the lights flickered momentarily. In that microsecond of darkness, I felt something brush past me, cold, insubstantial, yet undeniably present. My heart nearly seized, muscles locking in primal terror. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I pored over historical documents related to the museum, searching for any mention of unusual occurrences. Nothing significant emerged until I discovered architectural notes from the original construction in 1892. The West Wing had been built over the site of a photography studio that had burned down in 1888. No, I corrected myself, remembering newspaper accounts stated everyone had escaped the fire. However, the studio had specialized in post-mortem photography, that Victorian practice of photographing the recently deceased as mementos for grieving families. I returned the next morning, equipped with more sophisticated recording equipment. The sensation of being watched intensified the moment I entered the gallery. The metal panels seemed darker somehow, their matte surface appearing to pulse subtly like something breathing. I set up multiple cameras, standard, thermal, and one modified to capture ultraviolet light. Hours passed as I worked methodically, documenting the phenomena under controlled conditions. With each cycle of darkness, the negative images grew more distinct, more numerous. They no longer merely circled but approached, their movements becoming more deliberate, more aware. In thermal imaging, their heat signatures intensified, creating patterns that resembled written language when viewed in sequence. By late afternoon, my scientific detachment had eroded completely. My shirt clung to my sweat-soaked back, hands trembling uncontrollably. Something fundamental had changed. The entities now remained partially visible even when the lights were on, appearing as subtle distortions in the air, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. I attempted communication, first through written questions held up to the cameras, then verbally. No direct response came, but the patterns changed, becoming more concentrated around me. The temperature fluctuations intensified, freezing cold alternating with pockets of stifling heat. My ears registered subtle variations in atmospheric pressure, creating the sensation of whispers just below the threshold of hearing. As sunset approached, casting long shadows through the skylight, I made a critical discovery while reviewing the ultraviolet footage. The UV camera had captured what the others missed, residual trails left by the entities, glowing faintly like photographic emulsion exposed to light. These trails matched exactly the placement of photographs in exhibitions from the past century, exhibitions long dismantled and archived. The implication struck me with physical force. These weren't random manifestations, but impressions left by past observers, somehow captured and preserved by the unique properties of this space. The metal panels weren't reflecting light, but absorbing and storing visual information like some impossible photographic plate, recording not just images, but the very presence of those who had stood before them. This theory was confirmed when I discovered my own negative image among them, a perfect rendering of myself from the previous day, repeating my exact movements. The room was capturing us all, creating permanent records of transient moments. I considered abandoning the exhibition entirely, but realized that wasn't an option. Whatever forces operated here had been accumulating for decades, perhaps centuries. My presence had merely activated what was already there, like developer solution revealing a latent image. I made a decision then, one that professional colleagues might consider career suicide, but felt instinctively correct. I would proceed with the exhibition, but with a crucial modification. Instead of displaying contemporary photography, I would leave the walls bare, installing only carefully positioned lighting that would activate at programmed intervals, plunging sections of the gallery into calculated darkness. The exhibition would reveal itself, the accumulated visual history of the space, manifesting as these photographic negatives in air. Visitors would become both observers and subjects, simultaneously viewing and being recorded by whatever impossible process operated within those metal panels. I've spent the past week preparing appropriate context materials, explaining the phenomenon in terms of experimental photography and interactive art, rather than anything supernatural. The board members were skeptical until I demonstrated a controlled manifestation. Their expressions transformed from doubt to awe as they witnessed negative images form in darkness, their own thermal signatures joining the complex choreography captured by my instruments. Tomorrow we open to the public. I've named the exhibition Negative Space, Photography Without Cameras. Advanced ticket sales have broken museum records. Critics have been sworn to secrecy after preview viewings left them visibly shaken, but enthusiastically supportive. As for me, I've made peace with what happens in the darkness of that gallery. I've accepted that when I walk through the exhibition tomorrow, my negative image from today will be there, watching me watching it in an infinite regression of observer and observed. Sometimes at night, alone in my apartment, I feel the familiar sensation of silent flashes in my peripheral vision, glimpsing negative images of figures moving just beyond focus. I've begun to understand that once recorded by that impossible process, one never truly leaves the frame. The boundaries between subject and medium have dissolved. The exhibition will be my masterpiece, though I'll share credit with co-creators I can never name. After all, art has always been about capturing moments in time, preserving what would otherwise be lost. I just never expected those moments to be looking back. Story 7. And the first time I felt it, that unnatural stillness, my body knew something was wrong before my mind could process it. Working the night shift at Harborview Dry Port, I'd lifted thousands of containers over my 15 years operating cranes. Each one has its own voice. Empties ring hollow. Filled ones produce a dense thud of contained mass. But container number 4872B in Yard 4 was silent. Not quiet. Silent. As if the sound itself had been consumed by whatever lurked inside. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as I sit in my crane cab at 2 a.m., hands trembling on the controls, I wonder how much longer I have before whatever is growing in those containers decides it's done waiting. My name is Marcus Reed, 15 years at Harborview Dry Port, and until recently, the job was as mundane as they come. The rhythm of the port had become my heartbeat, the mechanical growl of engines, the warning beeps of reversing vehicles, the metallic groans of containers being hoisted and stacked. I could tell you the weight of a container just by how my crane responded when lifting it. It was a simple existence. Predictable. That changed on April 18th, when the shipment from overseas arrived at Yard 4. 28 containers, all listed as empty returns in our inventory system. Standard procedure is to stack empties in the back lots, but something felt off from the moment they arrived. The manifest indicated each container should weigh approximately 2.2 tons empty, but my instruments showed readings between 8 and 9 tons each. I reported the discrepancy to my supervisor, Marshall, who shrugged it off as a calibration issue and told me to continue operations. That night, I needed to relocate 3 of these containers to make room for an incoming shipment. The first one I lifted, container SHAR 4872B, produced that unnatural silence I mentioned. Every container makes noise when suspended. It's physics. Metal creaks, contents shift, echoes reverberate inside hollow spaces. But this one, nothing. It was as if the container had swallowed all sound. The hairs on my arms stood up. My mouth went dry. 15 years of experience told me something was fundamentally wrong. I lowered the container and radioed Marshall, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what happened. He responded with obvious irritation, reminding me about our tight schedule and suggesting I was imagining things. After all, it was nearly 3 a.m. I should have insisted. I should have refused. Instead, I completed my shift, moving all 3 containers while trying to ignore the unnatural weight distribution and that awful, consuming silence. The next day, I arrived early to inspect the containers in daylight. The security guard, Ramirez, gave me an odd look when I explained where I was heading. He mentioned that the night patrol had been reporting strange equipment malfunctions near Yard 4, radios producing static, flashlights dimming, watches stopping. Maintenance had found nothing wrong with any of the equipment. As I approached the containers, I noticed something peculiar about their appearance. They were standard corrugated steel, painted the faded blue of the shipping line, but in direct sunlight, there was something off about the color. It seemed to shift slightly when observed from different angles, like an oil slick on water. I blinked, and for a split second, I could have sworn the doors had changed to a pearlescent, opalescent hue that seemed to drink in the surrounding light rather than reflect it. My throat constricted. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool morning air. This was impossible. Containers don't change color. I was exhausted, that's all. Working too many night shifts had my eyes playing tricks on me. I approached container 4872B and placed my palm flat against its surface. The metal felt wrong. Not cold as steel should be in the morning air, but room temperature, as if it were insulated from the outside world. And there was something else, a barely perceptible vibration, like a giant motor running at such a low frequency that it was more felt than heard. I pulled out my phone to document this, but the screen flickered and died as I approached the container. When I stepped back 10 feet, it powered back on, battery suddenly at 20%, despite being fully charged when I arrived. Over the next week, I observed the containers whenever possible, documenting everything in a notebook since electronic devices seemed to malfunction in proximity. The vibrations continued, growing stronger at night. Standing near the containers after dark, I could feel them through the soles of my work boots, a rhythmic thrumming that reminded me of massive industrial equipment, but at a frequency just below human hearing. Other workers had begun to notice strange occurrences. Equipment operators reported navigation systems failing near Yard 4, displaying the word dormancy instead of error codes. 2 maintenance workers complained of intense headaches and nosebleeds after spending an hour replacing lights in that section. Marshall finally took notice when a junior operator refused to move containers in Yard 4 after experiencing what he described as time slipping. He claimed to have spent only 20 minutes relocating containers according to his watch, but returned to find 3 hours had passed. Marshall dismissed him as having fallen asleep on the job, but I recognized the fear in the young man's eyes. He wasn't lying. I approached Marshall in his office, bringing my notebook of observations. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I laid out everything I'd documented: the weight discrepancies, the absence of sound, the vibrations, the equipment malfunctions, the temporal anomalies. I suggested we contact the shipping company for verification of contents, or perhaps even alert port authorities. Marshall's response was unexpected. Instead of dismissal, he leaned forward, lowering his voice to tell me this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. 3 years ago, before I transferred to this port, a similar shipment had arrived. Workers reported strange phenomena, but the containers were quickly transferred to a government facility, and everyone was instructed to forget about it. He advised me to do the same: observe, document if I must, but keep it quiet. There were powerful interests involved, he implied, and asking questions could mean losing more than just a job. The warning should have deterred me. Instead, it only intensified my need to understand what was happening. That night I volunteered for an extra shift, ensuring I would be alone in Yard 4 during the quietest hours. Around 2 a.m., I positioned my crane above container number 4872B. The vibrations had grown stronger, pulsing through the metal frame of my machine. My instruments flickered between normal readings and that unsettling word, dormancy. I lowered the hoisting cables and secured them to the container's corners, then began to lift. The moment the container left the ground, something changed. The vibrations ceased abruptly. My ears popped as if the air pressure had suddenly dropped. And then, darkness. Not just around the container, but extending outward like an ink stain spreading through water. The yard lights dimmed in a perfect circle around the suspended mass. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hands trembled so violently I could barely maintain my grip on the controls. Every instinct screamed at me to drop the container and run, but a terrible curiosity kept me in place. Then I saw it. As the container hung suspended in that unnatural darkness, hairline fractures appeared along its seams, not breaking apart but opening like sutures. From within these lines emerged a faint, pulsing light, not illuminating but somehow deepening the darkness around it. The opalescent glow shifted through colors that had no names, that shouldn't exist in our spectrum. I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to expand as I watched the container transform. The steel surfaces rippled like fabric in a breeze, though the air was completely still. The fractures widened, revealing glimpses of something within, geometries that hurt to look at, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that defied physical laws. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the suddenly frantic beating of my heart. I felt blood trickling from my nose, tasted copper on my tongue. My vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. With the last of my conscious control, I released the container. The moment it touched the ground, everything snapped back to normal. The yard lights blazed. The vibrations resumed. My breathing returned in painful gasps as I hunched over the controls, blood dripping onto my shirt. I don't remember leaving the crane or driving home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my bathroom, staring at my reflection. My nose had stopped bleeding, but the whites of my eyes were shot through with red, as if every capillary had burst simultaneously. My skin was ashen, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. I called in sick the next day, and the next. On the third day, Marshall called to check on me, his voice casual but strained. He mentioned that a team from head office had arrived to conduct inventory in Yard 4. He thought I might want to know. I returned to work the following night, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The containers in Yard 4 had been rearranged. 5 were missing, including Darir 4872B. When I asked about them, my co-workers simply shook their heads and changed the subject. No one wanted to discuss what had happened, but the vibrations hadn't stopped. If anything, they had intensified, spreading beyond Yard 4 to the surrounding areas. Standing in the port now feels like standing on the skin of a massive, sleeping creature that's beginning to stir. Last night I noticed something that froze the blood in my veins. The remaining containers in Yard 4 were leaking. Not water or any conventional fluid, but a thick, opalescent substance that clung to the ground like mercury, but moved with apparent purpose, forming intricate patterns before sinking into the concrete. This morning, those patterns were visible as discolorations in the surface, spreading outward from each container like root systems. When I placed my hand on one of these marks, I felt that same vibration, but also something new. A sensation like static electricity, but deeper, as if something were attempting to communicate through the molecular structure of my skin. I've started to dream of those containers. In my nightmares, they're not containers at all, but cocoons, incubators, and whatever they're nurturing is nearly ready to emerge. Tonight, as I sit in my crane surveying the yard, I notice the vibrations have synchronized. The containers pulse in unison now, their surfaces rippling in waves that distort their shapes when viewed from the corner of my eye. The dormancy message on my instruments has changed to awakening. My radio crackles to life, startling me. Marshall's voice comes through, telling me to return to the main office immediately. There's an unusual edge to his tone, not fear, exactly, but resignation. As if he's finally accepted something he's long been denying. I should go to the office. I should leave this place entirely, run as far as possible. But I know it wouldn't matter. Whatever is happening here has already spread beyond containment. Those missing containers have been transported elsewhere, forming new nodes in a growing network. The vibrations have become audible now, a deep thrumming that resonates in my chest cavity. The yard lights are dimming again, but not just around one container. Everywhere, as if the very concept of illumination is being drained from the world. I feel a strange calm descending over me as I watch the containers below. Their surfaces have fully transformed, becoming translucent, revealing shapes inside that move with deliberate intelligence. The opalescent glow pulses in patterns that almost make sense, like a language on the verge of comprehension. I understand now why the word dormancy appeared on our instruments. These things, whatever they are, have been sleeping, gathering energy, and now they're waking up. My radio crackles again. This time, it's not Marshall's voice that comes through, but a sound like rushing water, like distant surf breaking against an alien shore. Within that sound, I can almost discern words, concepts that human vocal cords were never meant to articulate. The container directly below my crane, one I haven't moved yet, is changing most rapidly. Its walls have become completely transparent, revealing a space inside that seems impossibly vast, extending far beyond the container's physical dimensions. Within that space, something massive shifts and unfolds, stretching appendages that seem to bend through dimensions I can't perceive. My hands hover over the crane controls. I should drop this container, crush whatever is emerging, but I know it won't matter. There are 22 more in the yard, and who knows how many have already been transported elsewhere. The vibrations have synchronized with my heartbeat now, or perhaps it's the other way around. My vision pulses with each beat, the world alternating between hyperclarity and smeared abstraction. I feel my perception expanding, taking in aspects of reality I was never meant to see. I understand now why these containers absorb sound. They're not blocking it. They're transforming it, converting our physical energies into something else, something they can use. They've been feeding on us, on our technology, on the very foundations of our reality, preparing for what? The container below has completely dissolved now, its contents fully revealed. What rests in its place defies description. A massive organic mechanical hybrid that pulses with that same opalescent light. It doesn't move so much as reconfigure, parts of it seeming to vanish and reappear, as if cycling through dimensional planes. My radio emits one final burst of that rushing sound, and somehow I understand. They haven't come to destroy. They've come to transform, to elevate. The word dormancy wasn't referring to their state. It was referring to ours. Humanity has been dormant, blind to the true nature of reality, and these visitors intend to wake us up. I should be terrified, but that strange calm persists. As I watch the entity below extend tendrils of light upward toward my crane, I realize I'm about to become part of something vaster than I can comprehend. The first point of contact in a conversation that will change everything. The tendrils reach my cabin now, passing through metal and glass as if they weren't there. They touch my skin, and knowledge floods into me. Histories of civilizations beyond our universe. Technologies that manipulate the fundamental forces of reality. Consciousnesses that exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. I understand now why the containers were marked as empty. In our limited perception, they were. What they contained couldn't be measured by our instruments or comprehended by our senses. Until now. The port stretches out before me, containers glowing with that same inner light, fractures widening, entities emerging. Above, the night sky seems to fold inward, revealing spaces between the stars that pulse with familiar opalescence. Whatever happens next, our world will never be the same. The dormancy is ending. The awakening has begun. Story 8. The first time I saw the particles float from the canvas, I thought it was just dust. But dust doesn't move with purpose. Dust doesn't seek out the whorls of your fingerprints or burrow beneath your nails with the sensation of heated sand. Dust doesn't whisper in tones so low you feel rather than hear them. I know better now. What I mistook for simple pigment was something far older, something that had been waiting patiently for centuries, something that had finally found a suitable harbor. I've been restoring paintings for 23 years. The Merchants Guild commissioned me to authenticate and restore what they believed to be a Flemish seascape from the early 18th century. The piece arrived in my Boston studio, wrapped in acid-free paper and sealed in a climate-controlled crate, standard procedure for works of significant age and value. What wasn't standard was the inexplicable weight of the canvas, as if it contained something denser than oil and wood. The painting itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. A misty harbor scene rendered in muted grays and blues, a small coastal village partially obscured by fog. No signature was visible, though that wasn't unusual for the period. What struck me immediately was the fog itself, rendered with a luminous quality I couldn't quite place. The technique was masterful, creating an impression of movement within the static image, as if the mist was slowly rolling across the water's surface. My initial assessment noted significant oxidation of the varnish layer and potential microbial growth along the lower edge of the canvas. I photographed it extensively for my records before beginning the standard cleaning process. I recorded every step meticulously in my restoration journal, as I always do. That first night in my studio, I applied a gentle solvent to a small corner of the canvas. The reaction was immediate and unusual. Instead of dissolving normally, the lighter pigments seemed to disintegrate into fine particles that drifted downward like ash. I felt a peculiar sensation as they settled onto my hands, a warmth that contradicted their appearance. Some particles appeared to move laterally across my skin before disappearing beneath my fingernails, leaving behind a gritty sensation that persisted even after thorough washing. I noted this anomaly in my journal and took additional photographs, intending to consult with a colleague who specialized in unusual pigment compounds. I locked the studio before heading home, my fingers still tingling with an uncomfortable warmth. The following morning, I discovered the first impossible change. The painting had somehow reverted to its original state. The test corner I had cleaned showed no evidence of my work. I checked my photographs from the previous day, confirming I hadn't imagined the cleaning. Yet the canvas before me was pristine in its aged state, identical to when it had arrived. except it wasn't quite identical. The village in the background had shifted slightly. The buildings appeared marginally closer to the foreground, and I could now distinguish a single illuminated window that hadn't been visible before. I compared the painting to yesterday's photographs, measuring the proportions carefully. The change was subtle but undeniable, approximately 4 centimeters closer when scaled to actual size. I convinced myself it was an optical illusion, perhaps a result of the changing morning light or my own fatigue. I proceeded with my work, applying the solvent to the same corner again, documenting the same peculiar disintegration of pigment. Again, the particles drifted onto my skin, burrowed beneath my nails, and left that unsettling warmth behind. That evening, I made detailed notes about the solvent reaction and included my observations about the apparent spatial shift in the image. I secured these notes in my filing cabinet before leaving. The pattern repeated the next morning. The painting had reverted to its unclean state, but the village had advanced further toward the foreground. Now several windows glowed with a faint amber light, and I could discern the vague shapes of what might be a harbor with moored vessels. More troubling, the wooden frame of my studio window nearest the painting had darkened, as if slightly charred, and carried the distinct odor of burned driftwood. When I checked my filing cabinet, my notes from the previous day were gone. In their place was a single yellowed page covered in faded nautical notations, compass bearings, and cryptic phrases. Shadow transport routes, and anchoring procedures for internuncio tide. The handwriting was not my own. It was tight, cramped, and slanted sharply to the right, as if written by someone in great haste. My rational mind searched for explanations. Someone was accessing my studio at night, replacing the painting with progressively altered versions, removing my notes, and planting these strange documents. But the security system showed no breaches, and the only set of keys remained in my possession. I installed a motion-activated camera facing the painting before leaving that evening. The footage I reviewed the next morning showed nothing for the first several hours. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the video became distorted with rolling waves of static. When the image cleared at 3:43 a.m., the painting was already in its new state, with no indication of how the change had occurred. The village was now prominently featured in the foreground, with numerous lit windows and distinguishable streets leading down to a harbor filled with tall ships. The wooden frames around my studio windows had darkened further, and small cracks had appeared in the plaster nearby. Most disturbing was a sound captured on the video that I hadn't heard in person. A rhythmic creaking, like the strain of ship timbers in high seas, clearly emanating from the direction of the painting. When I approached the canvas that morning, I could hear it faintly. The unmistakable groan of wooden masts swaying in the wind, accompanied by what sounded like distant water lapping against a hull. The gritty sensation beneath my fingernails had spread, my nail beds darkening with what appeared to be fine black sediment. Washing no longer alleviated the discomfort. When I pressed my fingertips together, I could feel a subtle grittiness, as if I had been handling sand. I contacted Professor Hargrove at the university, describing the painting without mentioning the inexplicable changes. He agreed to examine it the following day, his interest piqued by my description of the unusual pigment reaction. That night, I stayed in the studio, determined to witness the transformation directly. I positioned myself in a chair opposite the painting, coffee thermos in hand, lights on full brightness. Around 2 a.m., I noticed the first change, not in the painting, but in my studio. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, as if the darkness there had gained substance. The overhead lights dimmed gradually, though the power remained stable. At 3:15 a.m., a thin mist appeared to form at the base of the canvas, coiling upward along the edges of the frame. My breath fogged in the suddenly chilled air. I stood, approaching the painting cautiously. The mist continued to build, pooling on the floor beneath the easel. When I extended my hand toward the canvas, the fog reacted, curling around my fingers with deliberate movement. I felt that same warmth spreading across my skin, the particles from the painting becoming one with the mist, seeking entrance through my pores. I instinctively jerked back, but not before the mist had enveloped my hand to the wrist. The creaking sounds intensified, and I could now hear other noises. The distant calls of men, the slap of waves against wood, the clink of metal against metal. The smell of salt and tar permeated the studio, overwhelming the chemical scents of my restoration materials. The mist continued to spread from the painting, filling the room ankle-deep, obscuring the floor. Within it, I caught glimpses of movement, shapes that suggested human forms moving with purpose, carrying objects, working with the deliberate rhythm of men accustomed to labor. I backed away until I hit the wall, my heart pounding against my ribs. My breathing came in short, painful gasps, my mouth too dry to call out, though there was no one to hear. As I watched in horror, the mist began to coalesce into more substantial forms. Not quite solid, but no longer merely vapor. Shadowy approximations of human figures moved through my studio, ignoring my presence completely. They manipulated objects I couldn't see, following patterns and procedures incomprehensible to me. One figure paused near my desk, seeming to make notations on invisible paper. The overwhelming urge to flee propelled me toward the door, but as I grasped the handle, I found it transformed, now ornate iron, crusted with rust and salt, unmistakably older than anything that should exist in my modern studio. When I pulled it open instead of the hallway beyond, I saw only dense fog and the vague outline of a wooden dock extending into darkness. I slammed the door shut, my back pressed against it, sweat soaking through my shirt despite the chill. The shadowy figures continued their work, oblivious to my panic. One passed within inches of me, carrying what appeared to be a coil of heavy rope that left a trail in the mist along the floor. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, forcing myself to believe this was hallucination, perhaps caused by chemical exposure from the restoration process. When I opened them again, the figures had vanished, though the mist remained. The painting on the easel now showed the village in alarming proximity, the harbor clearly visible, filled with ships whose lanterns glowed with unnatural brightness. As dawn broke, the mist receded gradually, draining back into the painting like water down a funnel. By the time full daylight filled the studio, all evidence of the night's phenomena had disappeared, except for the changed painting, the darkened wood of my studio fixtures, and the persistent, painful grittiness beneath my fingernails that had spread to the creases of my palms. Professor Hargrove arrived as scheduled, but found nothing unusual about the pigment composition when he tested it. He saw only a moderately valuable 18th century seascape, interesting but not remarkable. He didn't notice the village was now centrally featured in the image, the harbor crowded with ships, numerous windows illuminated. He didn't hear the creaking that had become constant to my ears, or smell the salt and tar that had replaced all other sense in my perception. He suggested I was overworked, recommended a colleague who might take over the restoration. I declined politely, watching him leave with a sense of abandonment. I knew with certainty no one else would see what I saw. This connection was exclusive. The painting had chosen me specifically, for reasons I couldn't yet comprehend. That evening, I discovered my skin had begun to change, tiny dark patches appearing along my forearms, rough to the touch like barnacles forming on a ship's hull. The grit beneath my nails had hardened, turning my fingertips into something that rasped against paper when I tried to make notes. These notes, too, disappeared overnight, replaced with more nautical calculations and mysterious coordinates. A week has passed since then. The village in the painting now occupies the entire canvas, the perspective shifted as if viewed from a ship approaching the harbor. Every window glows with amber light, and diminutive figures can be seen moving along the docks. The mist rises from the canvas each night, bringing with it the shadowy workers who now acknowledge my presence with respectful nods as they go about their incomprehensible tasks. My studio has transformed gradually, the walls darkening and developing the texture of weathered planking, the windows narrowing and thickening, the floor acquiring a slight but perceptible tilt. The smell of the sea is constant, as is the sound of water against wood and the creaking of phantom timbers. My skin continues its metamorphosis, the barnacle-like formations spreading across my chest and back, my fingernails thickened and darkened to the consistency of shell. The grit that once felt foreign now seems a natural part of me. my blood carrying sediment that settles when I remain still for too long. I understand now what the painting truly is. Not merely an image, but a portal. A boundary between worlds that thins with each application of my solvents and brushes. The fog harbor is reaching through, establishing an outpost in our realm, using me as its anchor point. The nautical diagrams left in place of my notes are instructions, a process I've been unwittingly following, preparing for what they call the internuncio tide, the moment when the boundary dissolves completely. Tonight will be different. The diagrams indicate a convergence, a perfect alignment that occurs once every 303 years. The mist figures have been preparing my studio meticulously, rearranging furniture into configurations that correspond to markings on their nautical charts, positioning me as the central component of whatever ritual or mechanism they're constructing. I should be terrified, should be fleeing, contacting authorities, seeking help. Yet I feel a strange calm, an acceptance. Perhaps it's too late for resistance. Perhaps this was inevitable from the moment I first touched the canvas. Or perhaps the grit in my veins has already transformed me enough that I welcome what comes next. The harbor waits. The ships are docked, their cargo holds empty, their crews assembled on the wharves visible in the painting. They are waiting for something to be loaded, or someone to arrive. As dusk falls, I position myself before the painting one last time. The mist is already forming at the edges of the frame, more substantial than ever before. I extend my transformed hands toward it, feeling the familiar warmth as the fog curls around my fingers, recognizing me as one of its own now. I don't know if I'm being consumed or converted, transported or transformed. All I know is that the boundary between observer and observed has blurred beyond recognition, that I have become part of the artwork, even as it has become part of me. The internuncio tide rises, and I stand ready to serve as its harbor in this world, or perhaps to find my true place in that other realm that has been calling to me through layers of ancient paint and carefully crafted illusion. The fog thickens, the harbor beckons. I step forward. Story 9. The cold that permeates these mountain resorts isn't just a matter of temperature. It seeps into your bones like a promise that some things were never meant to be disturbed. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the elevator of the Blackwood Alpine Resort, my camera equipment hanging heavily from my shoulder, my tablet displaying the property assessment forms that would guide my next 3 days. The brass indicator needle trembled between floors as we ascended, a subtle vibration that seemed less mechanical and more anticipatory. My name is Daniel Mercer, property auditor for historical hotels. 15 years documenting the forgotten corners of America's architectural heritage. The job description sounds mundane on paper. Photograph, measure, document, assess. But old buildings have memories. They breathe, they watch. Usually I find comfort in their silence. Not today. The Blackwood had been partially shut down for renovation, with only the main lodge and south wing remaining operational during the off-season. My assignment involved documenting every decommissioned room before the major structural work began next month. Standard procedure, except for the 4th floor, which appeared strangely inconsistent in the original blueprints compared to the modern renovation plans. Take extra care with the 4th floor north corridor, my supervisor had mentioned in her typically dispassionate tone during our briefing call. There's a discrepancy in the room count that needs clarification for insurance purposes. She hadn't elaborated further, just flagged it as a priority in the digital work order. The resort manager who greeted me in the ornate lobby, a thin man with perpetually moist palms and darting eyes, seemed relieved when I mentioned my 3-day timeline. Most auditors rush through in a day, he'd said, avoiding direct eye contact. They never properly document the 4th floor, always claim the photographs didn't save correctly. Before I could probe further, he'd handed me the master key card and retreated to his office, leaving behind only a lingering recommendation that I complete the upper floors before sunset, when the light is better. I began methodically, working my way up from the 2nd floor. Each room revealed the expected scenes of a historic alpine resort: heavy wooden furniture, thick drapery, vintage fixtures. The work was straightforward, almost meditative. By late afternoon, I'd completed 3 floors without incident, meticulously photographing each square foot, measuring doorways, documenting historical features alongside structural concerns. Then came the 4th floor. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway significantly narrower than those below it. The carpet, a deep burgundy with geometrical patterns that seemed to shift slightly under my gaze, absorbed the sound of my footsteps. Unlike the rest of the hotel, which smelled faintly of pine and furniture polish, this corridor carried a metallic odor that coated the back of my throat. The emergency exit sign at the far end flickered intermittently, despite all other lighting functioning normally. According to my tablet, the north corridor should have contained 10 rooms. Before me stretched a short hallway with only 3 doors, each bearing brass numbers that had tarnished to near black: 401, 403, and 405. I double-checked the blueprint overlay on my tablet. The digital floor plan clearly showed 10 rooms along a corridor, nearly 3 times this length. My first thought was simple. The renovation had already begun, walls demolished and reconfigured ahead of schedule, but the dust-free carpet and untouched wallpaper suggested otherwise. I snapped preliminary photos of the corridor and approached the first door, sliding the master keycard through the reader. The lock disengaged with an unusually deep mechanical clunk. Room 401 appeared normal enough: king bed, desk, armoire, bathroom, though the window overlooked a section of the mountain I couldn't reconcile with the building's orientation. I photographed methodically, measuring dimensions that matched the specifications on my tablet. Nothing unusual except for a persistent sensation of being watched that I attributed to professional paranoia after too many years in empty buildings. The strange feeling intensified when I re-entered the hallway. The air felt heavier, almost viscous. I blinked rapidly as my eyes adjusted to what seemed like a subtle change in the corridor's proportions. The ceiling appeared slightly higher. The wallpaper pattern, interlocking geometric shapes in faded gold against cream, seemed to have shifted, the designs now flowing in a different direction. I advanced toward the second door, room 403. As I moved, something caught my peripheral vision, a widening of the wall to my right, silent and fluid, like witnessing the interior of the building exhale in slow motion. Where there had been solid wall, a wooden panel slid backwards, revealing another door. Its brass number plate read, "and 2." My heart lurched uncomfortably. I consulted my tablet, finding no record of a room 2 on any floor plan, historical or modern. The schematics still showed only the original 10 rooms with standard numerical designations. I photographed the new door, watching the image appear on my tablet screen, only to see the file immediately relocate itself to a folder labeled "Temporal Anomalies" that I hadn't created. Professional curiosity overcame my growing unease. I approached room 2, noting how the wood felt unusually warm beneath my fingertips, almost like skin. The key card reader accepted my credentials with a soft hum rather than the mechanical click of the others. The door swung inward. I stepped into what appeared to be the same corridor I had just left. Disoriented, I turned around to find the door had disappeared, replaced by solid wall. Ahead of me stretched the same burgundy carpet, the same cream and gold wallpaper, but with subtle differences. The emergency exit sign no longer flickered, but glowed with steady crimson intensity. And at the far end of the hallway stood a figure with a camera. My figure, photographing a door. I raised my hand experimentally. The distant figure did not mirror my movement. Instead, it continued methodically documenting the door, unaware of my presence. A perfect doppelganger engaged in the same work I had been doing minutes earlier. The floor beneath me creaked, a long, low groan of old wood. Then another creak sounded, slightly out of sync with my breathing, my heartbeat, my thoughts. Footsteps that weren't mine, following a rhythm just different enough to create a disorientating counterpoint. I couldn't see who or what was making them. I retreated, backing away from my double, and felt my shoulders connect with a door that hadn't been there seconds before. It swung open behind me, depositing me back into the original corridor. Except now, where there had been 3 doors, I counted 7. New additions had appeared, each bearing doubled Roman numerals: 2, 4, 6, 8, X, 2, 3, 5. My breathing quickened, heart hammering against my ribs with such force I could feel the vibration in my fingertips. I fumbled for my tablet, finding that the blueprint overlay now showed a different configuration, a spiraling layout impossible for this building's structural footprint, with rooms arranged in a pattern that would intersect the physical space of floors above and below. At the bottom of the screen, a footnote had appeared in crimson text: corridor auto-indexed, access reserved for next temporal inventory. The rational part of my mind, the part that had cataloged over 3,000 hotel rooms without incident, seized upon a logical explanation, an elaborate prank by staff, a hallucination from mold exposure, exhaustion-induced perception distortion. I'd skip this section, report the discrepancy, and recommend structural engineers verify the actual layout. But when I turned toward the elevator, the corridor stretched before me, now impossibly long. The emergency lighting cast shadows that pooled across the ceiling rather than the floor, defying physics in a way that sent cold sweat trickling down my spine. I forced myself forward, focusing on the elevator doors that seemed to recede with each step, while behind me came the steady counterpoint of footsteps that nearly, but never quite, matched my pace. I reached for my phone to call the front desk, finding no service. The walkie-talkie provided by management emitted only a low, rhythmic humming punctuated by what sounded disturbingly like whispering in a language I couldn't identify. Logic dictated I continue my documentation while maintaining professional composure. My fingers trembled as I photographed each new door, watching as the images automatically sorted themselves into folders I hadn't created. Iterations, convergences, paradox points. I approached door 6, drawn by a strange humming emanating from behind it. The brass handle turned without resistance. Beyond it lay the same corridor again, but now I observed myself from behind, watching as another version of me photographed yet another door. And beyond that version, visible through another open door, stood another iteration of myself, creating an infinite regression of Daniels, each documenting a reality slightly out of phase with the others. My mouth went dry. The metallic taste in the air intensified. I backed away, colliding with the opposite wall, which no longer felt solid but yielded slightly, like membrane rather than plaster. I jerked away to find my hand had left a depression that slowly refilled itself, the wallpaper pattern flowing to accommodate the disturbance. The rational explanations dissolved. This wasn't a renovation discrepancy or architectural curiosity. The fourth floor existed in some impossible state of spatial flux, expanding and contracting according to rules I couldn't comprehend. Each photograph I took seemed to stabilize certain configurations while destabilizing others, as if my documentation was simultaneously recording and creating the reality around me. I retreated toward what I hoped was the elevator, my auditor's instincts still functioning enough to continue photographing everything despite my mounting terror. The images captured showed distortions my eyes couldn't process, doorways that bent at impossible angles, corridors that twisted into Mobius configurations, shadows that moved independently of their sources. When I finally reached the elevator and pressed the call button, the doors opened immediately, as if it had been waiting. I stumbled inside, punching the lobby button repeatedly. The brass needle swung wildly before settling between indicators, and the car descended with unusual smoothness, almost like falling. When the doors opened, I found myself in what appeared to be the lobby, but subtle wrongness permeated everything. The massive chandelier, which had hung from chains, now seemed to grow organically from the ceiling, its crystal components pulsing with faint bioluminescence. The front desk stood unmanned, the computer screen displaying rapidly scrolling text in the same crimson font that had appeared on my tablet. I approached the exit, desperate for fresh air and rational space. As I pushed through the revolving door, a blast of alpine wind momentarily cleared my head. I turned back to look at the hotel facade, counting the floors. 1, 2, 3, 4. All appeared normal from the exterior. Yet when I checked my tablet, every photograph from the fourth floor showed spatial impossibilities, rooms that contained themselves, corridors that functioned as Mobius loops, doorways that served as quantum gates to parallel iterations. At the bottom of each image, the same footnote appeared: corridor auto-indexed, access reserved for next temporal inventory. I returned to my car, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before managing to unlock it. The rational part of my mind insisted I leave immediately, file an incomplete report, and recommend another auditor take over. But 15 years of professional thoroughness wouldn't allow it. I had a job to finish, even if it defied comprehension. That night in my motel room 10 miles away, I reviewed the footage, searching for evidence of tampering or rational explanation. The images remained unchanged, but continued sorting themselves into new categories: breach points, observer duplications, quantum superpositions. One folder labeled simply "Previous Auditors" contained photographs I hadn't taken. Dozens of men and women in various states of professional distress, all clutching cameras or tablets, all standing in that impossible corridor, their expressions ranging from confusion to terror. In the final image of that folder, a figure stood with its back to the camera. My jacket, my shoes, my equipment bag. The file name: Mercer Daniel Next Iteration, JPG. Sleep evaded me entirely. By morning, I'd convinced myself that exhaustion and the altitude had triggered some form of hallucination. I would return, complete my audit professionally, and seek medical attention afterward. The resort needed documentation before renovation. I had a responsibility. The morning staff greeted me normally as I entered the lobby, though the manager seemed surprised by my return. "Most auditors don't come back for the 4th floor," he remarked casually, as if commenting on the weather. Before I could respond, he disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only." I took the elevator directly to the 4th floor, camera ready, determination overriding fear. The doors opened to reveal a perfectly normal corridor with exactly 10 rooms, numbered conventionally from 401 to 410. No Roman numerals, no spatial impossibilities, no doppelgangers. I proceeded methodically, photographing each room, finding nothing unusual beyond outdated fixtures and minor maintenance issues. Relief flooded through me as I completed the final room. Hallucination confirmed. Perhaps carbon monoxide exposure or some alpine fungus had triggered a vivid episode. I entered the elevator, eager to complete my report and leave this assignment behind. As the car descended, I checked my tablet to organize the new photographs. To my horror, none of the images showed the normal corridor I just documented. Instead, they displayed the impossible spatial configurations from yesterday. Doors within doors, corridors that bent back upon themselves, multiple versions of myself captured in infinite regression. The elevator indicator panel flickered. The needle swung past the lobby marker and settled on a symbol I hadn't noticed before. 1. When the doors opened, I found myself in what appeared to be the lobby, yet subtly wrong. The same staff members stood at their posts, performing their duties with mechanical precision. Yet their movements seemed slightly too fluid, their smiles maintained for uncomfortably long durations. The manager approached, extending his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. You've completed the temporal inventory ahead of schedule." His voice resonated with harmonics impossible for human vocal cords. I backed away, clutching my tablet like a shield. On its screen, my completed report displayed a new heading: Blackwood Resort Temporal Alignment, Auditor Transition Protocol, and at the bottom, a final notation: Daniel Mercer, Auditor Class 3, successfully indexed. Ready for integration into permanent staff. Next temporal inventory scheduled for completion retroactively. I ran for the exit, bursting through the revolving door into the parking lot. My car waited where I'd left it, yet when I tried my key it no longer fit the lock. Through the window I could see the interior was subtly different. The steering wheel on the opposite side, the upholstery a color I'd never chosen. My phone displayed no service, the screen perpetually refreshing as if searching for a network that existed just out of phase with current reality. My wallet contained identification that was almost correct. My face, my name, but with a birth date 3 years different from my own. I turned back toward the Blackwood, where the manager now stood framed in the entrance, watching me with patient expectation. Behind him, the lobby had transformed, portions of it now resembling the impossible corridor from the 4th floor. Through the windows of what should have been the 4th floor, I could see multiple versions of myself peering out, each holding a camera, each documenting a slightly different iteration of the same terrible realization. I am still here at the Blackwood. I have always been here, documenting its impossibilities, cataloging its quantum states. Sometimes I'm on the fourth floor, photographing doors that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I'm in the lobby, greeting new auditors with damp palms and darting eyes. Sometimes I'm in the parking lot, realizing too late what the inventory truly means. The only constant is my tablet, endlessly reorganizing my photographs into folders that map the hotel's temporal iterations. And at the bottom of each image, the notation that has become my epitaph: corridor auto-indexed, access reserved for next temporal inventory. Story 10. The stars are watching me. Not the familiar points of light that have guided humanity for millennia, but something else. Something that pulses with an unnatural blue-green glow, arranged in spiral patterns that no human astronomer has ever catalogued. They appear every night at exactly 2:04 a.m. on the cracked dome of the abandoned Millfield Planetarium, projected by a machine that should be as dead as the building that houses it. I know, because I'm the one who disconnected it. Yet it awakens, night after night, to show me a sky that doesn't exist. At least, not in our universe. My name is Daniel Harmon. 3 months ago, I was just an amateur astronomer with a passion for celestial mechanics and a modest collection of telescopes. Now, I'm not sure what I am. Observer or observed, discoverer or discovered, predator or prey. All I know is that something is using the stars to find me, and I'm running out of time to understand what it wants. It began innocently enough. The city had scheduled the old Millfield Planetarium for demolition, having already stripped it of most valuable equipment. As a member of the local astronomy society, I had connections with the building manager who still oversaw the property until its final destruction. He knew of my enthusiasm and granted me access to document what remained. A favor between fellow enthusiasts, nothing more. The first time I entered the building, the musty smell of abandonment filled my nostrils. Dust, old paper, and the lingering chemical tang of cleaning supplies long since evaporated. Debris crunched beneath my boots as I navigated the circular corridor leading to the main dome. The demolition crew had already begun their work, leaving gaping holes in walls and exposed wiring hanging like technological vines. The once grand foyer was a skeleton of its former self, display cases cracked and empty, promotional posters curling from moisture damage. But the planetarium's heart, the domed projection room, remained largely intact. At its center stood the Zeiss Mark IV projector, a hulking apparatus that resembled a mechanical insect more than a scientific instrument. Its twin spheres and protruding lenses gave it an almost sentient appearance, like the compound eyes of some technological arthropod frozen in time. According to the manager, the projector had been disconnected from power weeks ago, awaiting specialized removal due to its historical value. I spent that first day photographing equipment, jotting notes, and basking in the melancholy of a scientific temple awaiting its executioners. As evening approached, I reluctantly packed my equipment, promising myself to return for more extensive documentation. The manager had provided me with a temporary keycard, assuring me that the security system was minimal, just enough to keep vandals at bay. It was during my third visit that I stayed past midnight for the first time. I had brought a portable battery pack to power my laptop, intending to map the exact positions of the remaining equipment. The planetarium had taken on a different character in the dark hours. The silence more profound, the shadows deeper, the occasional settling noises of the building more pronounced. I worked methodically, my headlamp casting a narrow beam across my notebook as I sketched and measured. At 2:04 a.m. precisely, I heard it, the unmistakable hum of the main projector coming to life. My blood turned to ice as the mechanical whir echoed through the empty dome. It was impossible. I had verified myself that the power cables had been cut, the electrical boxes empty of fuses. Yet the Zeiss was awakening, its joints rotating with the smooth precision of well-maintained machinery. I remained frozen in my chair as the first stars flickered into existence overhead. But these were not the familiar constellations I had studied since childhood. Instead of Orion, Ursa Major, or Cassiopeia, strange spiral patterns bloomed across the artificial sky, clusters of stars that pulsed with an unnatural blue-green luminescence. They seemed to throb in unison, like a heartbeat, or perhaps a form of communication. My scientific mind scrambled for explanations. A prearranged demonstration program, a mechanical malfunction, or perhaps I had simply fallen asleep and was dreaming. Yet the cool metal of my chair against my palms felt undeniably real, as did the quickening of my pulse and the cold sweat beading on my forehead. As I watched, transfixed, the stars began to move with purpose. The spiral patterns rotated, contracted, and expanded in what appeared to be a complex sequence. At the apex of the dome, directly above the projector, a vortex of light formed, a swirling maelstrom of the same blue-green stars, rotating with increasing speed. I raised my camera to capture the phenomenon, peering through the viewfinder. The image it showed made my hands tremble. The vortex was reflected in my camera lens, but when I looked up with my naked eyes, there was nothing at the center point of the dome, just the regular pattern of pulsing stars. Yet when I looked through any lens, my camera, my glasses when I removed them, even the glossy surface of my phone, the vortex was clearly visible, spinning with hypnotic intensity. After exactly 17 minutes, the projector shut down as suddenly as it had activated. The stars blinked out, plunging the dome into darkness once more. I sat motionless in the silence that followed, my breathing shallow and rapid. As my eyes readjusted to the darkness, I noticed something odd. Tiny points of light, like diminutive versions of the strange stars, floating in the air around me. They drifted lazily, seemingly unaffected by air currents, before gradually descending toward the floor and disappearing into the concrete. Simultaneously, an unusual scent filled the air, a mixture of sharp ozone, like after a lightning strike, and the rich organic smell of damp forest soil. It was so incongruous in this environment of dust and decay that I found myself inhaling deeply, trying to process the sensory contradiction. I convinced myself I had experienced some sort of hallucination brought on by fatigue and poor ventilation. I packed my equipment with shaking hands and left the building, promising myself I would not return without a proper explanation. Yet I did return the next night, and the night after that. Each time at precisely 2:04 a.m., the disconnected projector hummed to life. Each time the strange spiral constellations appeared, followed by the lens-only vortex and the floating points of light. Each time I documented what I saw, filling notebook after notebook with observations, sketches, and data points. After a week of observations, I began plotting the movement patterns of the strange constellations. Something about their rotations and positions seemed almost mathematical, like a complex equation played out in 3 dimensions. I input the coordinates into my astronomy software, expecting nothing coherent. What I got instead chilled me to my core. The software interpreted the star patterns as spatial coordinates, a route through space, starting from somewhere unfathomably distant and terminating at a very specific location on Earth. When I checked the final coordinates, my mouth went dry and my stomach clenched. They pointed exactly to the Millfield Planetarium, not just to the building, but to the precise spot where the projector stood. I began to research the planetarium's history, digging through old newspapers and interviewing former employees. Most accounts were mundane: budget cuts, declining attendance, the usual story of public educational facilities in the age of digital entertainment. But there were anomalies, whispered rumors of strange occurrences during the planetarium's final years of operation. A former technician, now elderly and initially reluctant to speak with me, eventually shared a disturbing account over coffee in his cluttered apartment. His hands trembled as he described occasional glitches in the projection system, unauthorized programs that would run themselves, showing star patterns that didn't match any known catalog. The administration had blamed software errors and faulty wiring, but the technical staff couldn't identify the source. Several technicians reported headaches, nosebleeds, and vivid nightmares after working with the projector during these episodes. Most disturbing was his claim that the building itself had been constructed on the site of an ancient indigenous observatory, a circle of standing stones that had been quietly removed and relocated during construction in the 1960s. According to local lore, the site had been used not just for astronomical observations, but for communication with entities believed to dwell beyond the stars. I dismissed his stories as the ramblings of an old man with too much time to embellish memories. Yet each night, as I sat beneath the impossible stars, his words echoed in my thoughts with increasing resonance. By the third week, I had developed a routine. I would arrive at the planetarium around midnight, set up my instruments, and wait for the 2:04 a.m. performance. I began bringing more sophisticated equipment, spectrometers, electromagnetic field detectors, even a Geiger counter. The readings were as impossible as the phenomenon itself. The spectrometer detected wavelengths of light that shouldn't exist in our visual spectrum. The EMF detector went wild during the projections, its needle pinned to the maximum. The Geiger counter registered radiation spikes that, while not immediately dangerous, were well above background levels. My sleep patterns deteriorated. When I managed to sleep at all, my dreams were invaded by the spiral patterns and blue-green light. I would wake gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, convinced that tiny points of light were floating around my bedroom. My appetite disappeared, and I lost weight rapidly. Friends stopped calling after I canceled plans too many times, too consumed by my nightly vigil to maintain social connections. One night, approximately 1 month into my observations, I decided to interfere with the projection. I had noticed that while the projector seemed to operate without external power, there was a moment just before activation when a subtle vibration ran through the machine. If I could disrupt that initial movement, perhaps I could prevent the full sequence. I positioned myself beside the projector at 2:03 a.m., my hand resting on one of its main gimbals. As the seconds ticked toward 2:04, I felt the first tremor of awakening. I pressed down hard, applying my full weight to prevent the rotation. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a burning sensation that started in my palm and shot up my arm like an electric current. I jerked away instinctively, my nose filling with the smell of singed flesh. In the beam of my headlamp, I examined my hand. A perfect impression of a spiral constellation had been branded into my palm, the skin raised and angry red, pulsing faintly with that same blue-green light. The projection began as usual, but this time, something had changed. The star patterns moved more rapidly, the pulses more urgent. The vortex at the center of the dome grew larger than ever before, and for the first time, I could see it without a lens, a swirling abyss of light that seemed to look back at me with malevolent awareness. The floating points of light at the end of the sequence were more numerous and lingered longer. One drifted close to my face, and I found myself inexplicably reaching for it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Just before my fingers made contact, it darted away, leaving a trail of blue-green phosphorescence in the air. That night marked a turning point. The burn on my palm neither healed nor became infected. It simply remained, occasionally throbbing in time with my heartbeat, sometimes glowing faintly in the dark. And the projections changed. They became more interactive, responding to my movements and proximity. If I approached the projector, the stars would contract defensively. If I retreated to the edges of the room, they would expand outward, reaching tendrils of light toward me like curious fingers. I began to notice other changes in the building as well. The demolition, which had been scheduled to continue, was repeatedly delayed due to equipment failures and permit issues. The few times I encountered workers on the site during daylight hours, they complained of disorientation, tool malfunctions, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. My research took on a fevered quality. I expanded beyond astronomy into archaeology, mythology, and quantum physics. I found references in ancient texts to watchers in the void and bridges between worlds made of light. I discovered scientific papers exploring theoretical wormholes and Einstein-Rosen bridges that could, in theory, connect distant points in space-time. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the planetarium projector wasn't just displaying images. It was opening a door. Last night, everything changed. I arrived at the planetarium at my usual time, setting up my equipment with the mechanical efficiency of established routine. But as 2:04 approached, I felt a change in the air pressure, a subtle pop in my ears like descending in an airplane. The scent of ozone and wet forest came earlier than usual, growing stronger with each passing minute. When the projector activated, the display was different. Instead of the spiral pattern spreading across the entire dome, all the stars concentrated in the central vortex, creating a tunnel of light that extended upward and seemingly beyond the physical confines of the dome itself. The floating points of light appeared immediately, but instead of drifting randomly, they formed a distinct path from the projector to the edge of the room, specifically to the chair where I usually sat. I followed the trail with my flashlight, tracking it to my usual observation point. There, on the seat of my chair, lay an object that hadn't been there when I arrived. A small, smooth stone that glowed with the now familiar blue-green light. It was covered in markings that resembled the spiral constellations I had been observing for weeks. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the burn mark on my palm. As I held it, the vortex of light overhead intensified, the tunnel stretching impossibly deep, revealing what looked like another sky beyond our own, a vista of alien stars and nebulae that stirred something primal and terrified in my brain. For the first time, I heard something from the vortex. Not exactly a sound, but a vibration that translated itself into meaning inside my mind. It wasn't language as we understand it, but I comprehended nonetheless. They had been watching, studying, learning through the lens of the projector. They had found a suitable observer in me, and now they were extending an invitation. The stone in my hand grew warmer, the spiral mark on my palm burning in response. The path of floating lights extended now from my position directly into the heart of the vortex. All I had to do was follow. I wish I could say I resisted out of some heroic human defiance. The truth is more complicated. What stopped me wasn't courage but curiosity, the same quality that had brought me to this point. Before I stepped into whatever lay beyond, I needed to understand. I needed data, context, purpose. I needed to know if I was being invited as an ambassador or summoned as a specimen. I placed the stone in my pocket and backed away from the light path. The vortex contracted slightly, the vibration in my mind taking on a quality I could only interpret as disappointment. The projection continued for precisely 17 minutes, as always, before shutting down. The floating lights lingered longer than usual before disappearing into the concrete. This morning, I made two decisions. First, I've documented everything, my observations, data, experiences, and theories, and stored copies with 3 separate individuals to be opened if I disappear. Second, I will return tonight with more sophisticated recording equipment. If the invitation is extended again, I will demand more information before accepting. The demolition has been rescheduled for next week. Perhaps that deadline is significant. Perhaps whatever lies beyond the vortex sees the destruction of its connection point approaching and is growing desperate. Or perhaps it has simply completed its preparation stage and deemed me ready for whatever comes next. The stone sits on my desk as I write this, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat, like a beckoning finger, like the rhythmic flash of a distant lighthouse guiding ships through dangerous waters. The spiral mark on my palm throbs in sympathy. Outside my window, the sun is setting. In a few hours, I will return to the planetarium for what may be the last time. I am afraid, but I am also an astronomer, an observer of distant worlds, a cataloger of the unknown. Whatever waits beyond that vortex of impossible stars has crossed unimaginable distances to reach this specific place, this specific time, this specific man. If I don't answer, someone else will, and they might not ask the right questions. Tonight, at 2:04 a.m., I'll make my decision. Follow the lights or turn away. Accept the invitation or reject it. Either way, I know with absolute certainty that I have been witnessed by something that dwells among alien stars, and it has found me worthy of attention. Whether that is a blessing or a curse remains to be seen. Story 11. The cold hits you first. Not the damp chill of underground spaces, but something deeper, a penetrating cold that seeps into your marrow and makes your teeth ache. I felt it the moment I descended the worn stone steps into the monastery's forgotten crypts, a place untouched for centuries until my arrival. The restoration committee had been clear: catalog the medieval reliefs and document their condition. Simple work, routine. Nothing in my 20 years of sacred art restoration had prepared me for what waited beneath. My footsteps echoed across ancient flagstones as I moved through the first chamber, the beam of my industrial-grade flashlight cutting through darkness thick as oil. The air hung heavy, laden with the scent of old stone and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic. My equipment bag weighed on my shoulder as I navigated between massive marble pillars that rose like silent sentinels, their surfaces adorned with worn carvings of saints and martyrs, their eyes seeming to follow my progress. The project coordinator had mentioned that parts of the crypt remained unexplored since a structural assessment in 1887. According to the monastery's archives, the monks had sealed certain sections after disturbances that were never clearly documented. The abbot who provided me access had been reluctant, his weathered face creasing with unspoken concern as he handed over the ancient iron key. He had merely suggested I finish before nightfall, when the monastery gates would close. A strange request, considering my work would take several days at minimum. I'd been methodically working for hours, photographing the incredible Romanesque carvings, when my light caught something unusual in the far corner, an alcove I hadn't noticed before. Moving closer, my boots crunched on what I initially mistook for sand, but proved to be a fine, almost powder-like dust that coated the floor in thin, even layers. The alcove opened to a smaller chamber dominated by a peculiar feature, a circular well approximately 5 feet in diameter, covered by a slab that appeared to be quicklime. The covering was cracked at its edges, revealing not darkness, but a strange, almost luminous mist that seeped upward. Against all logic, this mist behaved against convection principles, spiraling not upward but in tight horizontal patterns, as though guided by unseen currents. My thermometer registered a 17-degree drop from the surrounding area. Even through my heavy wool sweater, I felt the temperature plummet as I approached. More disturbing was the fine particulate matter suspended around the well, dust motes that seemed to pulsate in rhythm with my breathing. Scientific curiosity overwhelmed my initial unease. I switched on my recording equipment and laser measuring tools, preparing to document this unusual feature absent from the monastery blueprints. The laser meter's red beam disappeared into the opening where the slab had cracked, but instead of returning a measurement, the device flashed an error. Recalibrating, I tried again with the same result. According to the equipment, the beam simply ceased to exist after traveling approximately 2.3 meters into the darkness. Impossibly, the technology was failing in this specific location. I decided to record audio notes instead, speaking methodically into my digital recorder about the anomalous well. When playing back the recording, my blood ran cold. Beneath my voice was another sound, water bubbling, but with a rhythmic quality that mimicked speech. Whispering voices alternated between what sounded like Latin and something older, more guttural. I'm fluent in 6 languages, including ecclesiastical Latin, but this second language defied categorization. My hands trembled as I replayed the recording. The whispering grew more distinct with each replay, as though the voices were learning how to push through more clearly. I hadn't heard these sounds while recording. They existed only in the digital capture, impossibly embedded in the audio file. I approached the well again, my scientific mind struggling against mounting dread. When I directed my flashlight directly at the crack, the dust particles immediately responded, swirling faster and aligning into distinct geometric patterns, concentric circles, pentagrams, and more complex symbols I recognized from ancient alchemical texts. These symbols held information momentarily before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. The implications were staggering. Dust doesn't behave this way. It doesn't form perfect geometric shapes or respond to light with apparent intelligence. Yet here, in this forgotten chamber, natural laws seem suspended. I returned the following morning with additional equipment, sensors to measure electromagnetic fields, infrared cameras, and audio equipment with noise filtering capabilities. The monastery's caretaker had asked about my findings with poorly concealed nervousness. I'd mentioned only the reliefs, saying nothing about the well. Something in his averted gaze suggested he already knew what I'd found. Day 2 brought new phenomena. The temperature around the well had dropped another 7 degrees. Ice crystals now formed along the edges of the quicklime slab. More alarming were the changes to the dust patterns. They now formed without my flashlight's prompting, and had evolved into more complex configurations resembling mathematical equations and astronomical charts. My audio recordings captured more voices, now distinguishable as multiple speakers engaged in what sounded like ritualistic call and response. My Latin was sufficient to translate fragments. The gate stands ready, and that which waits below awakens. The other language remained impenetrable, though certain phonetic patterns suggested pre-Sumerian or Proto-Elamite structures. By the third day, my scientific detachment was crumbling. Sleep had become impossible, plagued by dreams of spiraling darkness and whispering entities. My appetite vanished. Worse, I began experiencing lost time, moments where I'd find myself standing before the well with no memory of approaching it. Once, I discovered my hand reaching toward the cracked slab, fingertips inches from contact before consciousness fully returned. The monastery's archives provided disturbing context. References to the lower chamber appeared in documents dating back to the 12th century, when the monastery was constructed atop ruins of an older structure. One text, written by a monk named Brother Theophilus in 1163, described voices from the depths that speak forbidden knowledge, and dust that dances to unholy geometries. The account ended abruptly with a warning. What dwells below must remain below. The seal weakens with attention. Observation strengthens its reach. The implications chilled me. Whatever existed beyond that quicklime barrier seemed to gain power through observation, a macabre inversion of quantum principles. More disturbing was the realization that my documentation work might be accelerating some dormant process. On the 4th day, I witnessed the slab move. Not dramatically, a minute shift of perhaps 3 millimeters, but enough to widen the crack. The mist emerged more thickly now, carrying that metallic scent that reminded me increasingly of blood. The whispering in my recordings had grown louder, occasionally punctuated by a sound like distant, wet laughter. My equipment began malfunctioning systematically. Batteries drained within minutes, digital files corrupted after recording. Most concerning, my phone now showed no signal where coverage had been spotty, but present before. I consulted the elderly monk who maintained the monastery library, carefully framing my questions about the lower chambers. His rheumy eyes had widened in recognition before he hurriedly crossed himself. According to legend, he explained reluctantly, the monastery had been built specifically to contain something discovered in a natural cavern, something the founding order had deemed contrary to God's design. The quicklime seal was regularly replaced every 40 years until the practice mysteriously stopped in the early 20th century. When asked about the dust formations and voice phenomena, the old monk fell silent, then suggested I speak with the abbot immediately. His parting words haunted me. It learns from being studied. It adapts to the observer. The abbot was less forthcoming. Upon hearing my discoveries, his face hardened into mask-like neutrality. In careful, measured tones, he explained that my work in the crypts was hereby concluded. The restoration project would focus solely on the chapel above ground. When I pressed for explanations, he merely stated that some knowledge was kept compartmentalized for the protection of souls. I should have listened. I should have packed my equipment and left. Instead, that night I returned to the crypts alone. The deterioration had accelerated dramatically in the 12 hours since my last visit. The quicklime slab had developed cracks throughout its surface, forming patterns identical to the symbols previously formed by the dust. The temperature had plummeted to near freezing. Most alarming, the dust now formed coherent three-dimensional structures that hovered mid-air. complex polyhedrons that rotated slowly, responding to my movements rather than my light. When I activated my recorder, the whispering came through in real time, no longer requiring playback to be heard. The voices spoke directly to me, using my name, describing my thoughts before I fully formed them. They offered knowledge, secrets of matter, energy, and dimensions beyond human perception. My trembling hand reached toward one of the floating dust structures, an inexplicable compulsion driving me forward. My fingers passed through the formation, and in that instant, my perception expanded. For a terrifying moment, I perceived reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, seeing myself from above, from below, from inside out. I saw the well not as a physical structure but as a threshold, a permeable boundary between incompatible states of existence. I saw what waited below. It cannot be described in human language, not a creature or entity in any conventional sense, but a mathematical principle made semi-conscious, a pattern of information that had evolved awareness over millennia of containment. It perceived humans as we might perceive characters written on paper, two-dimensional projections of greater complexity, and it was using our observation, our attention, to pull itself into our dimensional framework. The revelation broke something in my mind. I stumbled backward, knocking over my equipment. The recorder captured my incoherent babbling as I scrambled away from the well. The dust formations pursued me, stretching into tendrils that brushed against my skin with electric coldness. I don't remember reaching the stairs or emerging into the monastery courtyard. The night watchman found me babbling about sentient equations and geometries that think. I spent 2 weeks in the regional hospital, diagnosed with carbon monoxide poisoning from poor ventilation in the underground chambers. A convenient explanation that I've publicly accepted, but I know what I experienced. 3 months have passed, and I've abandoned sacred art restoration entirely. My dreams remain haunted by those perfect rotating structures and whispering voices, offering forbidden insights. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I find myself drawing those same geometric patterns unconsciously, my hand moving with autonomous purpose. The monastery has sealed the crypt entrance with concrete. The restoration project was quietly canceled. When I contacted colleagues about examining my audio recordings, I discovered all my digital files had transformed into white noise. All except one, a 3-second clip where, beneath the static, a voice clearly says my name followed by words that translate roughly to, "The observation continues." Distance is irrelevant. What has been perceived cannot be unperceived. Most disturbing is the fine powder-like dust I sometimes find arranged in perfect circles on my desk in the morning, and the way my shadow sometimes moves independently of my body, stretching toward the floor as if trying to sink through it, reaching downward toward whatever waits below. I know now why the monks used quicklime, not to keep something from climbing out, but to absorb and neutralize what continuously seeps upward. They weren't containing an entity. They were quarantining an idea that now lives in my mind, growing stronger each day. An idea that whispers how reality is merely a consensus illusion, how the spaces between atoms are vast enough to hold universes of alternative physics, and how the barrier between observer and observed is not merely permeable, but non-existent. I've calculated that I have perhaps 6 more months before the geometric patterns consuming my thoughts become self-sustaining. I've made arrangements with a remote monastery in Tibet where I will live in isolation, my brain activity monitored for anomalous patterns. It's the only containment protocol I can devise. Because the most terrifying truth is this: I am no longer simply afraid of what I found beneath that ancient monastery. I am afraid of what I am becoming because of it. Story 12. The rumble of tires against asphalt has been my lullaby for 15 years. Interstate highways at night, a universe of darkness punctuated by the rhythmic procession of reflective markers and the occasional bloom of headlights from approaching vehicles. I used to find comfort in this emptiness. Not anymore. For 3 months now, something has been following me through the dark corridors of America's highways, something that shouldn't exist, and it's getting closer every night. My name is Ray Harmon, and I drive overnight charter buses between major cities. The overnight routes pay better, fewer drivers willing to surrender their circadian rhythms to the nocturnal demands of the road. I've never minded. The solitude suited me, at least until the 311 started appearing. The first time I noticed it was on a return trip from Chicago to Nashville, a particularly desolate stretch of I-65, the kind where you can drive for an hour without passing another vehicle. The dashboard clock clicked to 3:11 a.m., and I felt a static charge in the air. The fine hairs on my forearms stood at attention, and the radio emitted a low, persistent hiss that hadn't been there seconds before. When I adjusted my rearview mirror, it appeared, an ancient Greyhound model, probably from the 70s, with the number 311 illuminated on its destination display. Its headlights blazed through the darkness, but the interior remained pitch black, as if the light couldn't penetrate its windows. I assumed it was another charter, perhaps running the same route. The coincidence of the number matching the time struck me as odd, but not alarming. I signaled and slowed slightly, pulling toward the right lane to let it pass. But it didn't. The bus maintained a precise distance of about 30 meters behind me, never gaining, never falling back. After 5 minutes of this peculiar procession, I increased my speed again. The 311 accelerated in perfect synchronicity. When I finally looked away to focus on the road ahead, a green light from my peripheral vision caught my attention. The electromagnetic activity gauge on my dashboard had spiked to maximum, a reading typically associated with driving through electrical storms. But the night sky stretched clear and star-speckled above me. Something cold and leaden settled in my stomach. When I looked back at my mirror, the road behind me was empty. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination born of fatigue and the hypnotic monotony of nighttime driving. But deep down, I knew better. There had been something fundamentally wrong about that bus. An emptiness that seemed active rather than passive, observant rather than vacant. The company mechanic found nothing to explain the electromagnetic anomaly, dismissing it as a glitch in the aging equipment. When I pressed him about whether another vehicle could cause such a reading, he just laughed. Said unless I was being tailgated by a rolling power station, there was no way another bus could trigger that kind of spike. His amusement faded when I showed him the tachograph readout. The paper displayed a perfect sawtooth pattern of electrical surges beginning precisely at 3:11 a.m. and ending 17 minutes later. Nothing like the gradual fluctuations you'd expect from normal operation. After that night, I began researching bus fleet numbers, calling contacts at other companies, checking transit authority records. Nobody owned or operated a bus with the designation 311. According to official records, that number didn't exist in any active fleet in the country. The second encounter came 3 nights later on a different route, this time heading west on I-40. Again, exactly at 3:11 a.m. Again, the electromagnetic spike. Again, the ancient bus maintaining that exact same distance behind me. But this time, something had changed. The destination display above its windshield, which had been dark before, now illuminated with green LED text. Passenger control completed. My throat constricted as I read those words, a visceral reaction I couldn't explain. The message itself seemed innocuous enough, perhaps administrative jargon for a completed route, but something about its clinical sterility, combined with that utterly dark interior, sent ice water running through my veins. I tried a different tactic this time, accelerating to nearly 90 miles per hour, well beyond safety regulations. The 311 matched my speed effortlessly, maintaining that precise 30-meter gap. When I slammed on the brakes, performing a maneuver that could have jackknifed a normal bus, the phantom vehicle decelerated with impossible smoothness, never closing the distance. After that night, the encounters became regular. Every route, every highway, always at 3:11 a.m., always for exactly 17 minutes. I began documenting everything: times, locations, electromagnetic readings, the state of the destination display. The pattern was perfect, mechanical in its consistency. Too perfect, too precise. My sleep deteriorated. During daylight hours, I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at the sound of diesel engines. Colleagues commented on my appearance, the hollow-eyed stare, the tremor in my hands. My supervisor suggested I take some time off, concerned about my fitness to drive. I refused. Something told me that the 311 would find me wherever I went, on or off the road. The psychological toll became unbearable. I lost weight, developed a nervous tic in my left eyelid, began seeing the number 311 everywhere. License plates, street addresses, receipts. When I mentioned the bus to other night drivers, they exchanged worried glances. One veteran driver pulled me aside later, advised me to seek professional help. Said the highways were known to play tricks on the mind after too many solitary miles. But I knew what I had seen, and I had proof. The tachograph readings, consistent night after night. Electronic evidence of something impossible. I installed a dashboard camera, determined to capture visual evidence. But each night when I reviewed the footage, the road behind me remained empty. Even during those 17 minutes when the 311 loomed in my mirror. More disturbing still, the audio picked up a low, rhythmic sound during those times. Something between a mechanical hum and the synchronized breathing of many people. By the third month, new details emerged. Condensation would form on the inside of my windows during the visitations, as if the air in the bus had suddenly become cold and damp. The radio would cycle through frequencies without my touching the dial, occasionally stopping on channels broadcasting nothing but static or fragments of conversations that sounded decades old. Once, for exactly 7 seconds, it played what sounded like a bus driver calling out stops on a route that, according to my research later, hadn't been in service since 1973. Last week, the pattern changed. At 3:11 a.m., as I braced for the now familiar appearance in my mirror, nothing happened. The electromagnetic gauge remained normal. The radio played contemporary music without interruption. For 15 minutes, I felt a cautious relief building. Perhaps whatever haunted me had finally moved on. Then, at precisely 3:28 a.m., the exact time the visitation would normally end, the 311 appeared not behind me, but ahead, visible through my windshield. It sat motionless in the middle of the highway, its headlights dark for the first time, but with its interior now dimly illuminated by a sickly green glow. My heart hammered against my ribs as I applied the brakes, adrenaline making my vision sharpen to painful clarity. The bus before me seemed to absorb the light from my high beams rather than reflect it, creating a visual black hole in the center of the road. I brought my vehicle to a complete stop 50 yards away. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to flee in the opposite direction, but some deeper compulsion kept me rooted in place. Through the windshield of the 311, I could make out a silhouette in the driver's seat, a figure too tall, too thin to be human, backlit by that nauseating green luminescence. The destination display flickered to life. Passenger transfer imminent. A raw animal fear gripped me. My mouth dried to sandpaper, and sweat drenched my uniform, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. I shifted into reverse, prepared to back away at maximum speed, when the figure in the driver's seat turned its head toward me with a motion too fluid, too seamless to be natural. For 17 seconds, I counted each one, a lifetime compressed into heartbeats. We regarded each other across the empty highway. Then, without warning, every electrical system in my bus failed simultaneously. Headlights, interior lights, engine, everything. The sudden darkness was absolute, oppressive in its totality. In the new silence, I heard something I'll never forget. The sound of my passenger door hydraulics activating, the distinctive hiss of the door sliding open. But I had no passengers. I was driving empty, returning from a drop-off. The sound of footsteps moved up the aisle behind me, multiple sets, moving with perfect synchronicity. My muscles locked, paralyzed by terror as I stared straight ahead at the 311, still visible despite the darkness, still glowing with that internal green light. The footsteps stopped directly behind my seat. Cold breath on the back of my neck raised goosebumps across my entire body. A voice spoke. Not in my ear, but directly inside my head. It wasn't a human voice. but rather the sound of many voices overlaid, speaking in perfect unison. Passenger audit required, it said. Discrepancy detected. The electrical systems in my bus suddenly reactivated. The headlights illuminated an empty road. The 311 had vanished. But as I frantically checked my mirrors, I noticed something that drained the last remnants of warmth from my body. The passenger manifest clipboard, which always hung empty beside my seat during return trips, now contained a single sheet of paper. On it, a list of names I didn't recognize, 37 in total, each one followed by a date. Identical dates from 47 years ago. At the bottom, in green ink that seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent interior lights, someone had written, "Collection scheduled." I quit the next day, surrendered my commercial license, moved 2,000 miles away to a small coastal town where I now work the day shift at a local hardware store. But I know it isn't over. 3 days ago, I saw a familiar green glow reflected in the store window while closing up. When I turned around, the street was empty. Yesterday, a customer paid for a purchase with exact change, $3.11. And this morning I found a bus ticket in my mailbox, though I never ordered one. The departure time, 3:11 a.m. The destination field contains only a single phrase, "Final collection pending." Tonight I will not sleep. I will sit facing my front door with every light in the house blazing. But I know it won't matter. Whatever began on that lonely stretch of highway isn't bound by locks or walls or distance. And at precisely 3:11 a.m., I expect I'll hear the sound of air brakes outside my window, followed by the hydraulic hiss of doors opening to welcome one final passenger. Story 13. The first time I saw the faces in the mirrors, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. A trick of light playing across the century-old glass, distorted by dust and time. But imagination doesn't drop the temperature 15 degrees in an instant. Imagination doesn't leave boot prints in the dust where no one walked. And imagination sure as hell doesn't load a golden pistol that wasn't there a moment before. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I'd been hired to restore Prosperity Junction, an abandoned Old West theme park sitting in the Nevada desert like a decaying corpse forgotten by its undertaker. 6 months of work for a decent paycheck, plus room and board in the small staff quarters that had once housed actors playing cowboys and saloon girls. The new owners planned to reopen by summer, capitalizing on some streaming Western series that had made everyone nostalgic for a time period none of them had actually lived through. The restoration team had been working on the park for 3 weeks before I arrived. They'd cleared away most of the tumbleweeds and scorpions, replaced rotting floorboards, and reinforced structurally unsound buildings. My job was to focus on the aesthetics, repainting facades, restoring original props, and creating that authentic Old West atmosphere that would separate an immersive historical experience from a tacky tourist trap. At least that's what the brochure would claim. The Hall of Mirrors had been added in 1978, long after the original park opened. It didn't fit the historical accuracy I was aiming for, but the owners insisted it was a crowd favorite and needed to stay. I understood why when I first entered. Despite decades of neglect, the room was impressive. Over 50 mirrors of varying sizes created an infinite maze of reflections. Some were warped funhouse mirrors, others perfectly clear. Brass fixtures that had once gleamed now sat tarnished and dull. Overhead, a network of aged spotlights and colored bulbs hung from exposed beams. Standing in the center, I cataloged the restoration needs, clean the mirrors, replace broken bulbs, rewire the electrical system, remove the thick dust that coated every surface. Simple, methodical work. I'd start tomorrow. That night, I reviewed the park's original blueprints in my temporary quarters. The Hall of Mirrors had replaced something called the Lucky Strike Saloon, a staged gambling hall where tourists could play rigged poker games for souvenir chips. According to the old promotional materials, the Lucky Strike had been one of the main attractions until a fire damaged it beyond repair in 1977. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the desert wind howling through the empty park like a wounded animal. I dreamed of card games and whiskey. The next morning, I entered the Hall of Mirrors armed with cleaning supplies and a ladder. The early sunlight streamed through the skylight, illuminating dancing dust particles. I moved methodically, starting with the perimeter mirrors. As I wiped away decades of grime, the reflective surfaces began to shine again, creating multiplying images of myself across the room. That's when I noticed the first discrepancy. In one of the freshly cleaned mirrors, my reflection wore a bowler hat. I froze, rag still pressed against glass. I wasn't wearing a hat. I hadn't brought a hat. I slowly pulled my hand away from the mirror and stepped back. The reflection stepped back too, perfectly mimicking my movements. Except it still wore that damn bowler hat. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat beaded along my hairline. I blinked hard, shaking my head. When I looked again, the hat was gone. Just my own startled expression staring back at me, multiplied 50 times across the room. Exhaustion, I told myself. Desert heat playing tricks on my mind. I worked through the rest of the day without incident, replacing bulbs in the overhead fixtures and cleaning about a third of the mirrors. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the skylight, I decided to call it a day. I gathered my supplies, giving the room one final glance before leaving. In the fading light, I could have sworn the mirrors didn't show my t-shirt and jeans, but instead reflected back a sea of waistcoats and pocket watches. I felt a chill crawl up my spine despite the desert heat, and my mouth went suddenly dry. I hurried out, not looking back. That night I researched the park's history more thoroughly. Prosperity Junction had opened in 1958, capitalizing on the Western TV craze of the era. For 20 years it thrived as families flocked to experience the authentic frontier life. Then came the fire at the Lucky Strike Saloon. The official report stated it was caused by faulty wiring, but local newspaper clippings hinted at something more sinister. 3 employees had been injured, though none fatally. The saloon was torn down months later and replaced with the Hall of Mirrors. The park's attendance declined steadily after that. By 1985, it had closed its doors permanently. I returned to the Hall of Mirrors the next day, determined to finish the job quickly. As I worked, I caught more discrepancies in the reflections. Sometimes my t-shirt would appear as a crisp white shirt with suspenders in one mirror, then return to normal in another. Occasionally, the modern spotlights I'd installed reflected back as hanging oil lamps. Each time, I forced myself to look away, to focus on the task at hand. Around midday, I was replacing a broken bulb when the ladder shifted beneath me. I lost my balance, grabbing wildly for support as I fell. My hand caught one of the new spotlights, tearing it from its mounting. It shattered on the floor with a crash that echoed through the empty building. I lay stunned among the broken glass, assessing the damage. Nothing seemed broken, at least not on me. I pushed myself up on my elbows and froze. Across the floor, reflecting in every mirror, weren't pieces of my modern spotlight. Instead, fragments of kerosene lamps littered the ground, small flames still flickering in the oil puddles. I scrambled backwards, my palms slicing on the very real broken glass beneath me. Blood smeared across the floor, my blood. But in the mirrors, it looked black against the wooden floorboards of a saloon. My breathing came quick and shallow as I stared at the impossible scene. In the mirrors, I wasn't sitting in a dusty attraction of an abandoned theme park. I was sprawled on the floor of the Lucky Strike Saloon, surrounded by broken oil lamps and men in period clothing who stared down at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. I blinked, and everything returned to normal. Just my own terrified expression, multiplied across dozens of mirrors. I fled the Hall of Mirrors, my hands still bleeding. The restoration supervisor asked what had happened when he saw my condition. I muttered something about broken glass and carelessness. He suggested I take the rest of the day off. I didn't argue. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to those reflections, to the impossibility of what I'd seen. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the original park had projected images onto the mirrors as a special effect. Maybe the fall had triggered some old mechanism, or perhaps I'd hit my head harder than I realized. The next morning, I returned to the Hall of Mirrors with new determination. I would finish the job today no matter what strange phenomena occurred. I worked methodically, refusing to dwell on the glimpses of waistcoats and bowler hats that occasionally replaced my reflection. By mid-afternoon, I'd cleaned most of the mirrors and restored the lighting system. Only one section remained, the back corner where a long counter ran the length of the wall. It reminded me of a bar. According to the blueprints, this room shared a wall with what had once been the Lucky Strike Saloon. As I wiped down the counter, I noticed something in one of the mirrors, a flash of gold against dark wood. I turned to look at the actual counter, nothing but dust and mouse droppings, but in the mirror, a golden pistol lay atop polished mahogany. My heart pounded as I stared at the weapon. It looked immaculately maintained, with intricate engravings along the barrel and a pearl handle. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the dusty counter before me. In the mirror, my reflected hand hovered above the pistol. A cold draft suddenly cut through the room, raising goosebumps along my arms. The temperature had plummeted, my breath now visible in the chilled air. And then I heard it, the distinctive creak of swinging doors. I whirled around, but the entrance to the Hall of Mirrors remained closed. When I turned back to the mirror, the scene had changed completely. No longer did it reflect the room I stood in. Instead, it showed the interior of an old saloon, filled with patrons in period clothing. Men played cards at round tables while others leaned against the bar. A player piano sat in the corner, though I couldn't hear its music. My own reflection stood in the middle of this scene, still wearing my modern clothes, looking as out of place as a smartphone in a daguerreotype. The saloon patrons didn't seem to notice me. They moved about their business, drinking and gambling, existing in a moment long past. Except for one man. He stood behind the bar, directly where I stood before the counter. Unlike the others, he stared directly at me, at my actual self, not my reflection. A cold smile played across his lips as he polished the golden pistol with a white cloth. My muscles tensed as a primal fear gripped me. Every instinct screamed danger. I backed away from the mirror, my feet leaden and clumsy. The barkeeper's eyes followed me, his smile widening to reveal teeth too sharp for a human mouth. The temperature continued to drop. Ice crystals formed along the edges of the mirrors. My breath came in visible clouds as my teeth chattered uncontrollably. My back hit another mirror, and I felt rather than saw the scene change within it. Now I was surrounded by reflected saloons, each populated by men in period dress, each featuring that same barkeeper with his golden gun and inhuman smile. He raised the pistol in each reflection, pointing it directly at me through the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cold had become so intense that my skin burned with it. In desperation, I lunged for my tool bag and grabbed a hammer. With a primal cry that tore from my throat, I smashed it against the nearest mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like screaming, falling in razor-sharp shards that somehow never hit the floor. Instead, they hung suspended in the air for one impossible moment before rearranging themselves, reforming the mirror's surface. The barkeeper's laughter echoed from every direction as I fell to my knees. The golden pistol gleamed in each reflection, now joined by dozens of patrons who all turned to stare at me with eyes that reflected no light. My body shook violently, partly from cold, partly from terror. I closed my eyes, unwilling to witness whatever came next. The swinging doors creaked again, closer this time, as if opening into the actual room rather than just in reflection. "They say he cheated at cards," a voice whispered, so close I could feel breath on my ear, though I was alone in the room. "Shot 3 men before they hanged him, but they never found his golden pistol." I forced my eyes open, turning toward the voice. Nothing. Just my own terrified reflection, multiplied across the room. Except now, on the real counter before me, not in reflection, sat the golden pistol. I scrambled backwards on hands and knees, no longer caring about dignity or courage. The gun gleamed in the artificial light, as solid and real as the floor beneath me. As I watched, paralyzed, frost began to form across its surface, spreading outward across the counter like living tendrils. The doors creaked a third time, and the temperature dropped so severely that my lungs seized. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think through the panic and cold. With the last of my strength, I lurched to my feet and ran. I didn't stop at the exit of the Hall of Mirrors or at the boundaries of Prosperity Junction. I ran until I reached my truck, fumbling with frozen fingers to start the engine. I drove away from that cursed place, the heater blasting as I struggled to stop shaking. I never returned to collect my things or my final paycheck. My frantic calls to the restoration company were met with confusion and then dismissal. According to them, the Hall of Mirrors had been demolished 2 days before I fled. A last-minute decision by the owners who wanted to restore the Lucky Strike Saloon to its original glory instead. But I know what I experienced. Sometimes when I catch my reflection in a window or mirror, I see a bowler hat on my head, or a waistcoat instead of my shirt. And occasionally, in the corner of my eye, I glimpse a golden pistol and a man with 2 sharp teeth smiling back at me. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress. The therapists suggest exposure therapy, visiting Prosperity Junction once it reopens to confront my fears. They don't understand that some reflections are better left unseen, some doors better left unopened. Because whatever watches from the other side of those mirrors hasn't forgotten me. And I know with cold certainty that one day, when I least expect it, I'll hear the creak of swinging doors and feel that sudden drop in temperature. And this time, there will be nowhere left to run.